So you want to learn about Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars? Well, the best place to start is stepping into that world that Napoleon inherited, a power vacuum. Because Napoleon did not create his opportunities for himself. Rather, he exploited and took control of what the revolutionaries had presented to him. And speaking of which, the French Revolution was the real catalyst. It smashed the aristocratic monopoly on military command. It destabilized every government in Europe, not to mention creating a rather paranoid environment for the nobility. It also created armies of unprecedented size, filled with men who fought not for a king, but for an idea. And those armies needed officers who were promoted on ability, not just on bloodline. It seemed that the whole game had changed, and into that gap stepped a Corsican artillery officer. He had no wealth, no title, no connections. What he did have, though, was an accent that made Parisian society laugh behind his back. Well, he also had this extraordinary capacity to look at a battlefield and see what no one else could, at a historical moment so chaotic that seeing clearly was worth more than everything that the old world had valued. This is part 1 of 3 of our series on the Napoleonic Wars. If you've watched the previous series on the French Revolution, well, lucky you. You'll have a bit more context. But of course, we'll spend a few minutes just setting that scene and giving you some background. But before we begin, let me just quickly welcome you. Hello to everyone joining us. Thank you to everyone supporting and keeping this crowd-funded channel ad-free. Here on YouTube, links to the Patreon memberships, donation links are in the description and pinned comment. And thank you for liking, commenting, sharing with your friends, all that good stuff. Now, that being said, let's get straight to it. And we should probably start in 1789. France was the most populous state in Western Europe, the cultural center of the Western world, and the country whose language served as this lingua franca, the medium of diplomacy, whose court at Versailles had been imitated by every petty German principality and Baltic duchy for a century. But by 1795, things had changed. It had executed its king and queen. It had destroyed its aristocracy as a governing class. Tens of thousands were driven into exile. Not to mention they guillotined approximately 40,000 people during the Reign of Terror. This culminated in them replacing their ancient institutions with a succession of revolutionary governments, and each one of them was more unstable than the last. The republic that emerged was not the utopia they were hoping for, not a stable polity at all, but rather a country with an enormous revolutionary army. That ticks the box. But they also had a destroyed financial system, wars on multiple fronts, and a political class defined primarily by who had survived thus far, and, well, those who were in terror of being next on the chopping block. Speaking of which, the Reign of Terror, the period from mid-1793 to the summer of 1794, in which the Committee of Public Safety governed France through systematic violence, had been the revolution devouring itself, the snake eating its tail. Robespierre and the committee had sent thousands to their deaths, including not just genuine counter-revolutionaries, but rival revolutionaries, moderate Republicans, and just ordinary people, unfortunate enough to have an enemy on a local committee of surveillance. Any slight infraction could end up with a death penalty, and the courts were making judgments rather quickly. In July of 1794, the Thermidorian reaction removed and executed Robespierre himself. denounced by the same colleagues who feared they were next on his list. The government that replaced the committee, the Directory, was a five-man executive composed of survivors who were simultaneously exhausted, corrupt, and unable to stabilize the wars or the economy. By 1799, France had been through 5 constitutions in a decade. The Directory was openly despised. The military officers returning from campaigns found a government that had been unable to pay or supply its armies, while enriching itself through the peace treaties those armies had won. There was a widespread, barely articulated sense that France needed someone capable of governing it, someone specifically who was from outside this system, who was not a politician. The rest of Europe was watching all of this with a mixture of fascination and horror. The monarchies of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia had formed coalitions to crush the revolution, and they failed. The revolution had proved militarily formidable even when it was consuming itself. The question in 1799 was not whether France would stabilize. It would, somehow, eventually. But everyone was thinking who was going to do this stabilizing. And ultimately, what kind of country are they going to have on the other side of it all? The revolution had also done something militarily transformative. The Ancien Regime army had been closed to talent at its upper levels since the Ségur Ordinance of 1781, which required officers seeking promotion to the senior ranks to demonstrate 4 generations of noble ancestry. The best commissions went to the best families. It didn't matter about your ability. It's all about who you know. The revolution dissolved this overnight. They threw it out. Aristocratic officers fled, resigned, or found themselves commanding armies whose soldiers no longer acknowledged their authority. And into that vacuum poured men who had been promoted entirely on the basis of demonstrated battlefield competence. Men like Ney, Davout, Lannes, Soult, Murat, who would become Napoleon's marshals, and, at their best, among the finest military commanders of the age. Napoleon himself was one of these great men. He had risen not through lineage, but through artillery, mathematics, and a gift for being conspicuously effective at the most critical of moments. The revolution made his entire career possible. It left a Napoleon-shaped hole right where it needed to be, and he was entirely aware of it. And indeed, he is our main character. So let's talk a bit about his origins. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15th, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica, which had been French territory for approximately 14 months. The island had been a Genoese possession, and it was sold off to France in 1768, meaning that Napoleon was French only by the narrowest accident of timing. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a minor Corsican noble of Italian descent. Very minor. A lawyer who had briefly supported Corsican independence under the legendary Pascal Paoli, before deciding with pragmatic flexibility that he would prove a family trait to make his peace with the new French administration. His mother, Laetitia, was by all accounts a woman of exceptional character. She was disciplined, unsentimental, financially shrewd, certainly the gravitational center of a large family that would need to navigate extraordinary reversals of fortune. In old age, when the whole of Europe was celebrating her son's victories, she reportedly said simply, "Let us hope it lasts." I suppose she'd seen enough reversals of fortune in her time to not put all her eggs in one basket, I guess. Napoleon arrived at the French military college in Brion at age 9. Speaking French with a Corsican accent that provoked mockery from classmates who regarded him. Well, he was basically a foreigner. That's all, really. Like we said, Corsica being this new possession, only French by that narrow margin. The experience of that alienation, of being an outsider who had mastered the system of his adopted country well enough to beat it at its own game, shaped him as durably as anything he encountered later. He learned the language quickly, excelled at mathematics, which required no cultural fluency, of course, and he developed a combination of fierce self-reliance and intense loyalty to a small circle of trusted friends that would characterize him for life. He was then transferred to the École Militaire in Paris, the military school, at 15 years old, and he completed a 1-year course that normally would take 2 for other people, graduating as a second lieutenant in the artillery. Now, not the cavalry or the infantry, the prestigious arms, but the technical branch, that rewarded mathematical ability and punished incompetence with lethal directness. You see, artillery was the right fit, or at least the right accident. French artillery in the late 18th century had been substantially modernized by the reforms of Gribeauval, who had standardized and lightened French cannons into a system more mobile and interoperable than anything their opponents possessed. An officer who mastered the Gribeauval system was mastering one of the genuine competitive advantages of the French military. Napoleon mastered it completely, of course, but then he went further, thinking about what artillery could do, not just in its conventional role of battering walls and supporting infantry, but as an offensive instrument that could be moved rapidly to create decisive concentrations of fire at a specific moment and place that decided, at a specific moment and place that decided an engagement. That's what I'm trying to say. His reading during these years ranged voraciously across history, geography, and military theory. Plutarch, Caesar, Frederick the Great, he took it all in. He was absorbing the model of great men who shaped history and measured himself up against it with a directness that would seem rather delusional, at least to anyone less talented. He was also, in these pre-revolutionary years, something of a Corsican nationalist. He wrote an unfinished history of Corsica. He idolized Paoli, the independence leader that his father had served and then abandoned. He submitted an essay to the Academy of Lyon on the question, what truths and sentiments ought to be inculcated in men for their happiness. But the essay did not win. But the presumption of a 20-year-old lieutenant from Corsica presuming to instruct humanity on the subject of happiness gives you a bit of a flavor of his self-regard at this stage. Well, when the revolution broke out, it resolved his identity rather than deepened his confusion. The Republic offered a France that an outsider could embrace, a France defined not by Versailles and the hereditary nobility, but this time by law, merit, and the career open to talent. Napoleon became French through the revolution, not before it. Now, one more biographical fact needs placing here, because it runs alongside the Italian campaigns in ways that illuminate both. In March of 1796, 2 weeks before he took command of the Army of Italy, Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais, a 30-year-old widow of a general who had been guillotined during the Terror. She moved in the circles of the Directory and was connected to Barras, Napoleon's political patron. The marriage was partly political, but it was also, on Napoleon's side, a passion of a kind that surprised people who knew him as cold and calculating in most contexts. The letters he sent Josephine from Italy during the campaign, some of the most ardent love letters in French literature, written in a feverish shorthand between orders and after battles, reveal a man capable of genuine emotional intensity alongside very cold strategic calculation. He wrote to her every day, sometimes twice in a day, producing dispatches of longing and jealousy. And it was justified, by the way. Josephine was two-timing him. She had an affair back in Paris. Well, he was, in this, in several other respects, considerably more complicated than the legend allows. Napoleon's first public demonstration of what he was capable of was the siege of Toulon in 1793, and it's worth talking about in some detail because it established a pattern that would repeat across his entire career. The situation when he arrived was a static siege. It was not working. Everyone was bogged down, and no one had any ideas. The conventional attacker's approach was being blocked by the fortifications that protected the harbor, and no one on the French staff had any clue of how to change the dynamic. Napoleon identified the problem with the geometric clarity that would become his signature. The correct target was not the city, but the anchorage, and the correct method was not to batter the walls, but to seize the height that commanded the water. A solution was available. It's just nobody had seen it until Napoleon came along. Well, his proposal was dismissed by the general in command, Carteau, a former painter who had been given his commission through political connections rather than military ability. Exactly the type of revolutionary army was producing in quantity. Napoleon persisted, though. He got support from the political commissioners attached to the army, including Augustin Robespierre, a younger brother of Maximilian Robespierre, and eventually the resources to act were given to him. The night assault on the height of L'Aiguillette was not a bloodless one. Napoleon himself was wounded. He took a bayonet thrust in the thigh that left a scar that he carried for the rest of his life. But it did succeed. The British fleet, finding itself within range of the French artillery, sailed out of Toulon harbor and didn't come back. The city fell. The promotion to brigadier general came within a week. The connection to Robespierre's circle proved briefly dangerous. When Thermidor came and Maximilian Robespierre was arrested and guillotined in July of 1794, Napoleon found himself under suspicion by association. He was arrested and held for 2 weeks before being released for lack of evidence. The arrest was a genuine threat, though. The guillotine was still fully operational, and the new masters of France were searching aggressively for anyone who might have been implicated in the terror. The experience sharpened his instinct, already acute, of course. But anyway, he got a little bit better at reading the political atmosphere and attaching himself to the winning side. He spent the next year in a period of uncertainty. His career stalled. Finances were precarious. He navigated the chaotic middle ground between the Directory's suspicious factions. What rescued him was another decisive action at exactly the right moment. In October of 1795, Royalist insurgents rose against the convention of the Vendemiaire uprising. A mob estimated at 20,000, gathering to overthrow the government that had been laboriously assembled after Thermidor. Paul Barras, one of the Directory's most powerful figures, remembered Napoleon from Toulon and summoned him to defend the government. Napoleon's response was characteristic. He positioned artillery at the key approaches to the Tuileries, and when the mob arrived, dispersed it with what subsequent accounts call a whiff of grape shot. Hundreds died in the streets of Paris, and the government was saved. Napoleon was made commander of the Army of the Interior, and within months he was given command of the Army of Italy. Now, may I just remind you, this all happened before he was 27 years old. Pretty good for a 26-year-old to be having that kind of appointment. The Army of Italy that Napoleon inherited in the spring of 1796 was an army in name only. The problems were it was undersupplied, underfed, and underpaid. It had spent months in the Ligurian Alps watching its officers argue about a strategy that none of them had the resources to execute anyway. Its soldiers had not been paid in months either. The horses were dying. Its general had been chosen for reasons had more to do with political maneuvering of the Directory than with any expectation of victory. Well, Napoleon arrived, toured the positions, assessed what he had, and issued what became one of the most famous addresses in military history. Soldiers, you are hungry and practically naked. The government owes you much and can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. He then went on to tell them what they would find there: honor, glory, and riches. Of course, the speech is a little polished in subsequent retellings, but to show something real about his relationship to the men who served him. He spoke to them directly. He got down on their level and acknowledged their actual conditions, and gave them a reason to believe that those conditions were about to change for the better. His operational method in Italy established the template for virtually everything that followed. The essence was speed and concentration. Divide to move quickly, force the enemy to divide in response, and then concentrate against one part before the other could arrive. His opponents in northern Italy, the Austrian and Piedmontese armies, were larger in aggregate than his own force, but they were spread across a front that gave him the ability to operate on interior lines, striking one army and then the other faster than they could coordinate their responses. In the opening weeks of the campaign, he drove between the two, defeated the Piedmontese army, and forced it to an armistice within 6 weeks, then turned his concentration on Austria. The speed was not accidental. Napoleon practically lived on horseback during a campaign, covering ground personally most generals left to staff officers. Arriving at positions he needed to assess directly, rather than just trusting on reports. His knowledge of the terrain he was fighting over was consistently better than his opponents, not because he had better maps, but because he had personally been there, and not many generals really bothered with that. But the physical exhaustion this entailed was real, but it was balanced out by the intelligence advantage it produced. The bridge at Lodi on May 10th, 1796, became his first great legend. French artillery needed to force a crossing of the Ada River under heavy fire from the far bank. Napoleon directed the guns personally, then organized and reportedly personally led, accounts vary on how exactly far he went with that, the charge that stormed the bridge under fire. The Austrians were driven back, the bridge taken. The story spread through the army and then through France. Their general shared their danger, stood where they stood, and led where he told them to follow. The soldiers began calling him Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal, an affectionate irony that acknowledged both his stature and his habit of leading like an NCO, rather than directing from some safe little place away from the battlefield. In any case, he seems to have treasured the nickname. Our goal in November 1796 provided another bridge, another legend, and another near death. The Austrian army had regrouped and was threatening to relieve the siege of Mantua. 3 days of brutal fighting at a crossing over the Alpone River produced one of the defining images of the Napoleonic era. the painting by Antoine Gingras, executed from life, showing Napoleon at the head of his troops advancing across the bridge with a tricolour in his hand. Well, the reality was a little less clean. Napoleon was pulled off the bridge by his own soldiers when the charge stalled, fell into a marsh and nearly drowned. The battle was eventually won by a flanking maneuver rather than a frontal charge. But Grande painted the image Napoleon wanted remembered, and Napoleon arranged to sit for the portrait, understanding even at 27 now that the visual record of his campaigns was a strategic asset to be managed alongside a military one. The Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797 concluded the Italian campaign on Napoleon's terms, negotiated by Napoleon himself without significant direction from Paris. A political overreach, by the way, the Directory tolerated, because they had no credible means of stopping it. Austria ceded Belgium and recognized French control of northern Italy. In exchange, France handed over Venice, which Napoleon had seized on a fabricated pretext, despite Venice being a sovereign neutral republic that had done nothing to provoke him. But he needed Venice as a bargaining chip, so he took it. The Venetians had maintained their republic for over 1,000 years, and it ended in a week. The callousness was noted at the time by people who had expected the revolution's armies to behave differently from the old dynastic powers. It would not be the last time Napoleon's strategic logic and the revolution's stated values pointed in opposite directions. You'll see what I mean. By 1798, Napoleon was the most famous soldier in France. Famous enough to be genuinely inconvenient for the Directory, which had no obvious way to employ him that did not increase his political power while keeping him occupied. The Egyptian expedition that emerged from these mutual concerns was partly his initiative, and partly that of Talleyrand, the foreign minister, who had sketched out the strategic rationale. Seize Egypt from the Ottoman Empire, threaten British trade routes through the eastern Mediterranean, potentially advance overland toward India, and threaten Britain's most valuable colonial possession. The plan looked really good on the map, which is where it remained the most compelling. Napoleon sailed in May of 1798 with 35,000 soldiers and a characteristic touch, a corps of 167 scholars, scientists, and artists. The Commission of the Sciences and Arts, he called it. He was intending to study Egypt as thoroughly as he conquered it. The savants he brought would eventually produce the Description of Egypt, a 23-volume survey that founded Egyptology as a discipline. One of his soldiers, digging fortifications near the town of Rosetta, found a black granite stone carved with a decree in 3 scripts, Greek, Demotic, and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, that would eventually allow Jean-François Champollion to decipher a writing system that had been unreadable for more than 1,000 years. The Rosetta Stone is now in the British Museum, removed there when the British defeated the French in Egypt, which is itself a fairly compact summary of how the Egyptian campaign turned out. Anyway, the army landed near Alexandria, marched across the desert in rather killing heat, soldiers dying of thirst and heat stroke before they even engaged the enemy, and met the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids on July 21, 1798. A quick note on the Mamluks: they were magnificent horsemen and individually formidable fighters. They had no answer to disciplined French infantry in square formation, however. The cavalry charges broke against the steady volleys, and the battle was over within the afternoon. Cairo fell. Egypt was militarily subdued in weeks. Then, on August 1st, 1798, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, and he destroyed it. Nelson's victory at the Nile was a masterpiece of aggression and intuition. The French ships were anchored in a line close to the shoals, their commanders believing this protected their shoreward flank. No one would risk navigating between the French line and sandbanks in the dark. Several of Nelson's captains did exactly this, threading through a gap the French had assumed was impassable, attacking from both sides simultaneously. The key fact about this maneuver, the thing that makes it remarkable rather than merely audacious, is that Nelson gave no specific orders for it. His captains understood what he intended from the way he had trained them, and the culture of initiative that he had built in his fleet, and they acted upon their own judgment. One of them, Captain Foley in HMS Goliath, led the way through the gap and the others followed. And so by morning, 13 of 17 French ships had been sunk or captured. Napoleon's army was stranded in Egypt. 35,000 men cut off from France with no reliable supply line and no viable retreat. The campaign was supposed to threaten India, but it had instead demonstrated with clarity that French power could be contained at sea in ways it could not be contained on land. That asymmetry, French dominance on land and British dominance on sea, it would be a continuing trend, defining the entire strategic structure of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon spent another year in Egypt and the Levant, marching north into Palestine, besieging the port of Acre, where the British, under the energetic Sir Sidney Smith, reinforced the Ottoman defenders and held the walls against repeated French assaults. Now, Napoleon never forgave Smith for this. He later said with characteristic hyperbole that Smith had cost him his destiny. The Syrian campaign produced one of the most contested episodes of Napoleon's career, the massacre at Jaffa in March 1799, where several thousand Ottoman prisoners were executed on his orders after the city's capture, because he lacked the men and supplies to guard them and refused to release them to fight again. Whether this was a military necessity, ruthlessness, or a war crime, that depends on the standard that you apply and who is writing the history. In any case, it happened. Napoleon wasn't denying it. He acknowledged it openly, and the event was carefully omitted from the official bulletins sent back to France. The plague was also killing soldiers faster than Ottomans too. In August of 1799, he handed command to General Kleber, took a small fast ship, slipped past the British naval patrols, and sailed for France. He left his army behind. Kleber wrote bitterly that he had been abandoned like a piece of luggage. Napoleon made it home in 6 weeks, and what he brought with him was a carefully managed narrative. The dispatches and accounts of the Egyptian campaign that reached France described the great victories, the pyramids, the military organization of Egypt, all of this in vivid detail. The destruction of the fleet and failure at Acre were present in the record, but, well, they were kind of pushed at the back a bit. Napoleon arrived in Paris not as the commander who had lost the fleet and abandoned his army, but as a hero of this daring Eastern expedition. The gap between what had actually happened and what France believed had happened was not accidental. He had been managing the information flow from Egypt since the campaign began, writing his own bulletins, controlling which correspondents sent what, and understanding that what France believed mattered as much as what France had actually experienced and received. The propaganda apparatus of the Napoleonic Empire really did begin in the shadow of those pyramids. And so he returned to France in October 1799 to find the Directory in its terminal phase. A second coalition, Britain, Austria, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, had reversed many of the revolution's military gains. The economy was a wreck. The government's authority was so degraded that tax collection had essentially broken down in several departments. The directors were maneuvering against each other more energetically than against France's enemies. And into this situation, Napoleon arrived with his Egyptian reputation fully intact. His political connections were still active, and his ambitions were thoroughly formed. The faction around the former director, Sieyès, had been looking for a general with popular support and no independent political program. A sword, in Sieyès' phrase, which could be pointed in the right direction. Of course, they chose Napoleon. He agreed, but he had his own plans as to which direction the sword would be pointed in. The coup of 1819 Brumaire, year 8, which is November 9th to 10th, 1799, remember that the revolution years were counted different, was by Napoleon's own later standards badly executed. The political dimension worked. Sieyès maneuvered the legislative councils out of Paris to St. Cloud on the pretext of a Jacobin conspiracy, positioning Napoleon as the army's protector of the Republic. But on the second day, when Napoleon appeared before the Council of 500 to address the deputies directly, something went terribly, terribly wrong. The deputies were angrier and less manageable than anticipated. Voices cried out, "Outlaw him!" the most dangerous formula of the revolutionary period, since it was the cry that had preceded the fall of Robespierre, and we all know what happened to him. Napoleon, by multiple accounts, went pale and seemed momentarily unable to speak. His brother Lucien, who was president of the council, saved the operation. He went outside to the grenadiers guarding the hall, informed them, falsely by the way, that assassins were within threatening his brother, and ordered the hall cleared. When the soldiers obeyed, the coup succeeded by Lucien's nerve and Napoleon's luck. And so Napoleon was installed as first consul, nominally the senior figure of a three-man executive with Sieyès and Ducos as colleagues. Sieyès had expected to be the real architect of the new settlement, using the willing general as a figurehead, while he designed the constitutional structure. He discovered almost immediately that his sword had precise views about governance. The constitution Napoleon produced, drafted at speed over several weeks, concentrated power in the first consul, to a degree that reduced the other two consuls to ceremonial irrelevance and made the legislative bodies advisory at best. Sieyès, presented with the outcome, reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we have a master." He was awarded a large country estate for his cooperation, and he retired permanently from politics. Now, I suppose after all of that time with the revolution, after what happened, the reign of terror and everything, retiring out to the countryside doesn't seem like a bad idea. But this quote, "Gentlemen, we have a master," to me, it sounds like they're coming full circle. That a decade before, they had their king and their queen, and now, well, they just have a king and a different name. Like I said, full circle. In any case, the pattern this established would be repeated across the next 15 years with monarchs, ministers, and marshals, that the collaborator who discovers too late the Napoleon's partnership means that Napoleon is running the show. The Constitution of Year 8 was ratified by plebiscite in December of 1799. The official tally showed over 3 million votes in favor and barely 1,500 against, numbers that even sympathetic accounts acknowledged were sufficiently adjusted upward. The real figures probably closer to 1.5 million in favor. Maybe. Napoleon was aware of the adjustment, and he sanctioned it. His reasoning, which was consistent and persistent across his career, was that the adjustment accurately represented the popular will, even if it did not accurately represent the actual count. France wanted what he was offering, and the precise arithmetical record was a bureaucratic detail that required a little bit of management rather than scrupulous accuracy. The capacity for self-serving reasoning about democratic legitimacy, the conviction that his own judgment of what the people wanted was more reliable than any actual count of their expressed preference, was already fully formed in 1799, and this, of course, would not moderate with age and wisdom. In the 4 years between Brumaire and the coronation of 1804, which we'll get to, Napoleon accomplished something that receives less attention than his military campaigns, but was in several respects more consequential. He built the administrative and legal infrastructure of the modern French state, working at the pace he maintained throughout his career, 12 to 16 hours of concentrated daily work, with an ability to switch rapidly between problems of completely different character. He simultaneously ended the revolutionary chaos in domestic governance, centralized state power on a scale that no French government had previously done, reformed the legal system from the ground up, rebuilt financial architecture, reorganized secondary education, and negotiated a religious settlement that ended a decade of civil-religious conflict. Busy boy, huh? The Napoleonic Code, the Code Civil de France, promulgated in 1804, is his most durable domestic achievement, and arguably his most significant legacy in the long run. Napoleon chaired many of the drafting sessions personally, working through the debates in his carriage during journeys, and returning annotated texts to the commission. The code swept away the extraordinary patchwork of Roman law, regional customary law, and the feudal custom that had governed different parts of France differently for centuries, replacing it with a single coherent legal system applicable uniformly across the country. It enshrined equality before the law, security of property, and freedom of contract, the core legal gains of the Revolution, in a form precise enough to be consistently applied. 2 centuries later, the Code Civil remains the foundation of French law, and its influence extends to Louisiana, Quebec, large portions of Latin America, and the legal systems of Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal, among others. When lawyers in those jurisdictions argue about property rights or contract enforcement, they're still working within a framework that Napoleon's commission designed. The Concordat with Pope Pius VII, signed in 1801, closed the religious wound that the Revolution had inflicted. France had spent a decade in near civil war over religion. The Revolution had tried to create a national church, confiscated church property, executed priests, and driven practicing Catholics into resistance. Napoleon's position on religion was fairly pragmatic. He regarded it as a useful social technology, rather than a spiritual reality, and is reported to have observed that religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. That's one way of putting it, I guess. He did not believe, though, but he understood that France believed, and the conflict between the Republic and the Church was a source of genuine instability that he could not afford. The Concordat he negotiated recognized Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of French citizens. Now, not a state religion, which is a careful distinction. He established that the state would pay priests salaries in exchange for the church abandoning its claims to confiscated property, and gave the first consul the right to nominate bishops. Pius VII received considerably less than what he had hoped for. Napoleon received just what he needed. The religious civil war effectively ended, and the clergy reconstituted as a body of state-salaried functionaries with a professional interest in the stability of the regime. The administrative structure Napoleon imposed on France, the department system governed by prefects, appointed officials directly responsible to Paris rather than to local elites, gave the central government a reach into provincial administration that no previous French regime had approached. The lycée system established standardized secondary education designed to produce the meritocratic elite the empire would require. The Bank of France stabilized the currency and provided reliable government credit. The Legion of Honor created a system of civilian and military distinction that rewarded merit explicitly rather than birth. Napoleon called it baubles that led men, which is cynical and accurate simultaneously, and which has proved an exceptionally durable institution. The Legion of Honor still exists, by the way. All of this was accomplished in parallel with managing active military operations, a diplomatic agenda covering most of Europe and accumulated personal correspondence of a man who wrote his own letters at a rate that astonished his secretaries. His working methods during these years of consolidation have attracted attention from historians and management theorists alike, because they were genuinely unusual. He could dictate several letters on completely different subjects in rapid succession, switching between a note to a marshal about troop dispositions, and a reply to a minister about tax policy, and a letter to Josephine about household accounts, without losing the thread of any of them. He slept between 4 to 6 hours a night, frequently in short intervals, and compensated with a capacity to fall asleep virtually anywhere and wake refreshed within minutes, a skill that allowed him to work on campaigns with a stamina that exhausted men younger than him. His memory for facts, figures, and details of previous conversations was remarkable. Ministers who tried to slip past him with inaccurate data rapidly learned that the first consul remembered what they had told him 6 months earlier and would compare it with what they were telling him now. He was not infallible, though. His judgment on certain political and strategic questions would prove to be catastrophically wrong, without giving you any spoiler alerts. But within the sphere of administrative mastery, he was operating on a level that many of the people and institutions around him struggled to even match. The military backdrop to these years of domestic consolidation was shaped by one famous near disaster and a fragile peace. In the spring of 1800, while Napoleon was building the institutional architecture of the consulate, the Austrian army had retaken most of northern Italy during his Egyptian absence. He crossed the Alps with the army of reserve through the great St. Bernard Pass, in a crossing he subsequently embellished for propaganda purposes. Though the genuine difficulty of moving an army with artillery through alpine snow in May was real enough, and descended into the Lombard plain to engage the Austrians. The Battle of Marengo, on June 14, 1800, began catastrophically for the French. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered in the morning fighting, they were being pushed back across the plain in serious disorder by early afternoon. The Austrian commander, Melas, 69 years old, and believing the battle won, sent his victory dispatches, went back to headquarters for dinner, and delegated the pursuit to subordinates. And then the French general, Desaix, arrived on the battlefield after a forced march toward the sound of guns. Desaix had been away from Napoleon's main force on a separate operation, and had turned back when he heard the artillery. He surveyed the situation and said, in a line whose exact words have been adjusted by subsequent tellings, though the substance is attested, that the battle was lost. But there was still time to win another. He led his fresh division into the Austrian advance, Kellermann's cavalry charged. The exhausted and disordered Austrians broke, and what had been a defeat became a decisive French victory. Tilsit was killed in the counterattack, therefore could not become a political competitor. Austria signed an armistice. Napoleon's political position was secured. The official version of Marengo, carefully managed in Napoleon's communiques, presented the battle as a masterpiece of deliberate strategy. The apparent retreat was a feint designed to draw the Austrians in before the planned counterattack. Well, this was substantially rather false. Marengo was a near disaster, rescued by a subordinate's initiative and a cavalry charge at the right moment. Napoleon knew this, which may explain why he spent years revising the official account, and why he rarely discussed the battle in detail in later years. As for Tilsit, he received an honorable mention in dispatches. Napoleon received credit for the victory. The gap between Marengo and the official record, and the Marengo of what actually happened, is an instructive early example of a pattern that would recur. You see, Napoleon was genuinely brilliant, and he was also a meticulous manager of his own legend. His bulletins were required reading across France. He understood, before anyone else had fully articulated the concept, that the narrative of the war itself is a strategic asset. And he managed it with the same attention that he gave to his troop dispositions. The Peace of Amiens in March 1802 gave Europe the only sustained general peace it would experience between 1792 and 1815. Britain recognized France's expanded continental position. France acknowledged British colonial gains. Both sides understood it as a pause. You see, Britain could not indefinitely accept French hegemony over the continent. France under Napoleon was not going to stop expanding. The 14 months of relative peace that followed saw Napoleon use the breathing space to become consul for life, ratified by a plebiscite even in August 1802 that produced 3.5 million votes in favor, and to consolidate the domestic reforms that the peace of earlier years had not allowed time to complete. The Peace of Amiens ended in May 1803, when Britain refused to evacuate Malta as promised, and Napoleon refused to make the commercial accommodations that Britain required. So both sides not really meeting their end of the bargain. They would be at war continuously for the next 12 years, with one short interval granted. And so, on December the 2nd, 1804, in Notre Dame, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself the Emperor of the French. The ceremony had been prepared for weeks, with obsessive attention to symbolic detail. Pope Pius VII had come from Rome, an extraordinary concession, the first pope to travel to France in centuries, his presence conferring the apostolic legitimacy that Napoleon needed. The imperial robes were designed by the painter David, who would also paint the ceremony's great record canvas. The crown was modeled on the crown of Charlemagne, explicitly invoking the last man to rule a unified Western Christendom as Napoleon's precedent. The detail that history remembers came when Napoleon reached the altar, took the crown from beside the Pope's hands, and placed it on his own head. Well, he did not receive the crown from the church, he took it himself, and he placed the Empress's crown on Josephine's head with his own hands too. Whether Pius was surprised by this, or had known it would happen, is debated in the sources. Some accounts say that the deviation from agreed protocol astonished him. Others suggest it had been arranged in advance. But what is certain is that the Pope was present, that his presence provided the sanctification that Napoleon wanted, and the terms of that sanctification had been entirely Napoleon's to dictate. The imagery was compressed and precise. The emperor was sovereign by the will of the French people, expressed in a plebiscite, not by the grace of God, mediated through papacy. It was mainly just what the people wanted. The revolution's child was declaring himself monarch, while simultaneously insisting that his monarchy was categorically different from all the other monarchies the revolution had overthrown, because his authority flowed upward from the nation rather than downward from divine appointment. Basically saying, trust me, it'll be different this time. I suppose the argument is coherent, but it's also convenient. But that doesn't really make it false. I suppose it's up to the individual's perception of it. Napoleon's own account of himself, in the conversations recorded at St. Helena after his final defeat, was that he had been the embodiment of the revolution, rather than its betrayer, that he had fixed and consolidated what the revolution had begun, translated its principles from chaos into durable institutions, and spread those institutions across Europe by conquest in ways that ultimately serve the cause of human liberty way better than the guillotine ever had. He believed this, or at least he said he believed it, with enough consistency to make simple cynicism an insufficient explanation. It's also true that the police state he constructed, the press censorship, the political prisoners, the wars of conquest that killed perhaps 3 to 5 million people across Europe during his tenure, none of these were the natural expression of liberty, equality, and fraternity that the revolution had originally wanted. The contradiction between the Napoleonic Code and the Napoleonic secret police, between the proclaimed sovereignty of the French nation and the actual concentration of meaningful power into a single man's hands, that is very real, and it is unresolved. But it's also a part of what makes him the most interesting political figure of the modern era. Simple villains and simple heroes are easier to understand. Napoleon was neither one of them. The irony of this was not lost on contemporaries. Beethoven had been completing his Third Symphony as an explicit tribute to Napoleon the Liberator, the embodiment of the revolution's promise that a man of talent and will could reshape the world. And when news of the coronation reached him in Vienna, he reportedly tore the dedication page in fury and renamed the work Eroica, the heroic symphony, the hero unspecified, the heroism no longer attached to a specific man who had turned out to want a throne. Thomas Jefferson, who had watched Napoleon's rise with complicated admiration, wrote that the coronation confirmed what he had suspected. Here was a man whose ambition had no natural ceiling, and who had used the language of republican virtue as a scaffolding for the construction of a personal empire. Well, Jefferson was right. He was also, in his own way, fair. The scaffolding had been real while it was being used. The Code Civil, the Bank of France, the prefect system, the lycées, these were all genuine contributions to the architecture of the modern state, and they did not become retroactively bad because the man who built them had always intended to be their master. Anyway, at the end of 1804, Napoleon commanded the Grand Army at Boulogne, where it had been training and drilling for 18 months for the invasion of Britain that the peace's collapse had made necessary. The army camped at Boulogne was unlike any military force that had ever existed. Its core system, large, self-sufficient formation of mixed arms, each capable of independent maneuver and sustained operations that could be combined or separated depending on strategic location, was Napoleon's operational invention, and it gave him a flexibility that armies organized on the old line and column model simply could not stand up to. He had 200,000 of the most seasoned soldiers in Europe, and he had them all settled on the Channel coast, officered at every level by men who had been selected entirely on demonstrated competence, commanded by marshals who had been tested in Italy and Egypt, and who understood both his methods and expectations. This was the force that would fight the great wars of the next decade. But the invasion of Britain would not happen. Nelson's destruction of the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar on October of 1805 would end any realistic prospect of French naval supremacy for the remainder of the wars. But Napoleon was already pivoting before Trafalgar, responding to the Third Coalition, Britain, Austria, Russia, Sweden, that William Pitt the Younger's diplomacy and British subsidy money were assembling against him. He broke camp at Boulogne in August 1805 and turned the Grand Army east in a march so rapid that the Austrians, still forming up to invade Bavaria, were enveloped and captured wholesale at Ulm before they had properly engaged. By December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation, by the way, a date he had chosen deliberately, he would win the most decisive engagement of his career at a village in Moravia called Austerlitz, destroying the combined Austrian and Russian armies in a single day's fighting that Frederick the Great, observing from whatever position history's great generals occupy, would have recognized as a masterwork. Europe would understand that the 15 years that had produced this moment were only part one. Of course, you'll have to wait till part two to hear the rest of the story. Thank you very much for joining me today on our part one of the Napoleonic Wars. We're certainly off to an interesting start. And of course, it's all going to speed up from here. Allow me to thank you for listening this far, all the way to the end. And thank you for liking, subscribing. Thank you for those keeping this crowdfunded and ad-free by following those links in the description and pinned comment. I will see you in part 3. Good night for now, and see you next time. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the Napoleonic Wars. Thank you very much for following along with our series. We are going to continue straight off from where we were last time. But just before we do that, give it a like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to help us crowdfund this ad-free project here on YouTube, you'll find some links in the description and pinned comment. All that being said, let's begin. On December the 2nd, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation in Notre Dame, Napoleon Bonaparte stood on a hill above the village of Austerlitz in Moravia, and he watched his plan work. The Austrian and Russian armies had done precisely what he had spent 3 weeks maneuvering them to do. They had attacked his apparently weak right flank, stripped their center to do it, and created a gap through which he now sent his strongest corps in a single crushing blow that split their line in half, and then rolled up both pieces from the inside. By 4 in the afternoon, the battle was won. By nightfall, the ice on the frozen ponds at the edge of the field was breaking under the weight of the fleeing men and artillery. Soldiers were drowning in the freezing water. 69,000 coalition troops had either been killed, wounded, or captured. French losses, roughly 9,000. By the judgment of most military historians who have studied it, it was the most perfectly executed battle in the history of European warfare. Between that afternoon at Austerlitz and the autumn of 1812, Napoleon achieved a dominance over the European continent that no single power had exercised since the height of the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was now dissolved, an institution that had existed in some form for 1,000 years, because it was inconvenient to his reorganization of Germany. He eliminated Prussia as a military power in a single day's fighting. He met the Tsar of Russia on a raft in the middle of a river, and they divided Europe between them. His brothers sat on thrones of Spain, Netherlands, Westphalia, and Naples. His stepson commanded in Italy. His marshals governed from Hamburg to Warsaw. The map of Europe was, for a few years, essentially Napoleon's map. And so that's where we are. Then today we're talking about the arc from the Third Coalition of 1805 to the catastrophe of the 1812 Russian campaign. The 7 years of Grand Empire, the period of Napoleon's greatest triumphs, and the moment the whole structure began to come undone. We'll follow the battles that made him seem invincible, the economic system that tried to strangle Britain and instead strangled his allies, the guerrilla war in Spain that bled France for years, the Russian campaign that, ended up being quite a disaster. In part 1, we built up the man and the state. And in part 2, we're watching both of them reach their zenith. Before Austerlitz, there was Trafalgar. On October 21st, 1805, off Cape Trafalgar in the southwestern coast of Spain, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson engaged the combined Franco-Spanish fleet of 33 ships with 27 British ships of the line and destroyed it. The French and Spanish lost 22 ships of the line, most captured, several sunk. The British didn't lose any, though Nelson himself died during the battle, shot by a French sharpshooter from the rigging of the Redoutable, while walking the quarterdeck of HMS Victory in full-dress uniform, a habit of conspicuous self-exposure that his officers begged him to stop doing for years. The British wept. Their hero was gone. France had lost its last serious naval force too, and with it, any realistic possibility of threatening Britain directly. Admiral Nelson, to this day, is remembered as a national hero, quite rightly so. Nelson's tactical method at Trafalgar was, like so much of what he did, a deliberate rejection of the received orthodoxy. Conventional fleet action in this period involved the two opposing sides sailing parallel to each other and exchanging broadsides until one side was too damaged to continue. A slow attritional process that tended to reward the numerically superior fleet. Nelson attacked in 2 columns perpendicular to the Franco-Spanish line, cutting through it at 2 points simultaneously, creating the close quarters melee that he knew his better trained crews would dominate. The approach involved sailing directly into the enemy's fire for the first 30 minutes with no ability to return it. The ship's bows faced the enemy guns, not their own broadside, and the losses in those minutes were severe. But Nelson had calculated correctly that the chaos that followed the line's breaking would produce the decisive result that a parallel gunnery exchange never would. He was willing to accept heavy early casualties to guarantee a catastrophic outcome for the enemy. His calculation proved correct. It cost him his life, but hey, it proved correct. Napoleon received the news of Trafalgar after Austerlitz, and by most accounts, received it with less distress than one might expect from a man who just lost his entire navy. He wasn't too surprised. He had never been confident about the French naval performance, and he had understood since 1803 that the invasion of Britain was a problem that he could not solve at sea. What Trafalgar settled definitively was the strategic shape of the entire Napoleonic period. Britain was unreachable by land and invincible at sea. France was unreachable by sea and invincible on land. The two powers were playing different games, and neither could directly strike at the other's core strength. The resolution of this standoff would drive the next decade of the war. The question of how a land power defeats a sea power or vice versa. Well, it would produce the Continental system. It would drive Napoleon into Spain, and then Russia, and eventually exhaust France in ways that military defeat alone could not. So let's wheel back around to Austerlitz for a moment. The three emperors who gave their name to the Battle of Austerlitz, that is, Napoleon of France, Francis II of Austria, and Alexander I of Russia, were all present or near the field on December 2nd, 1805. Only one of them had planned the battle. The other two just walked into it. Napoleon had spent 3 weeks conducting a masterclass in strategic deception, deliberately weakening his right flank, pulling back from positions he occupied, allowing his opponents to see what appeared to be a French army in a dangerously extended and vulnerable position. The Austrian and Russian commanders, seeing the opportunity to cut his line of retreat to Vienna, planned their attack exactly where he wanted them to plan it. On the night before the battle, when soldiers had lit fires along the French line in celebration of the coronation's anniversary, the scene was described by officers in both camps as one of the most striking they had ever witnessed. A line of fire stretching across a dark plain, both armies watching it, both knowing what morning would bring. The execution was as close as perfect, as battle of 73,000 men against roughly 90,000 can be. The coalition attack of the French right, led by the main weight of the Russian forces under Buxhoden, proceeded exactly as Napoleon had planned, pulling the Pratzen Heights, the high ground at the center of the field, progressively lighter as troops were stripped from it to reinforce the attack. At the moment Napoleon judged the heights sufficiently weakened, he sent Soult's corps up the Pratzen in the fog of a winter morning. The fog cleared at the critical moment, a piece of luck that Napoleon later attributed to the sun, called, in his words, the sun of Austerlitz, as if the weather had been part of the plan, which is characteristic. Soult's men took the heights, split the coalition army in two, and the double envelopment completed the destruction of both halves. The Russian Imperial Guard countercharged and was defeated, and by afternoon it was all over. Now the political consequences of Austerlitz were immediate and sweeping. Austria signed the humiliating Peace of Pressburg within weeks, surrendering Venice to the Kingdom of Italy, Tyrol to Bavaria, and large portions of its German territory to Napoleon's reorganized Middle European clients. More consequentially, Austerlitz prompted Napoleon to formalize the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, the institution that had provided the constitutional framework for the German-speaking Central Europe since Charlemagne. However, attenuated its actual authority had become over the centuries. In August of 1806, Francis II abdicated as Holy Roman Emperor and reconstituted himself as Francis I, Emperor of Austria only. The Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire had memorably remarked was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, ceased to exist after roughly 1,000 years. In its place, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of German states under French protection that provided troops for the French army, not to mention a buffer against Prussia and Austria. The map of Central Europe had been substantially redrawn. Prussia had sat out the Third Coalition, watching from a position of studied neutrality that it had convinced itself was strategic caution. After Austerlitz, with the Holy Roman Empire dissolved and the French satellite states established across Germany, the Prussian King Frederick William III found his position to be untenable. Surrounded by French-aligned territory, his army untested since Frederick the Great's campaigns 40 years earlier, facing a French army that had just destroyed the best forces that Austria and Russia could field. he declared war in October of 1806, and on October the 14th of that same year, his army was completely destroyed in a single day. Better luck next time, I suppose. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt were fought simultaneously about 15 miles apart. At Jena, Napoleon engaged what he believed to be the main Prussian army and mopped the floor with them, driving it from the field in chaos. At Auerstedt, Marshal Davout, commanding a single corps of 27,000 men, encountered the actual main Prussian force of 63,000 under the Duke of Brunswick, and they defeated them too, with Brunswick mortally wounded in the fighting. Davout's victory at Auerstedt was in strict military terms the more remarkable achievement. A corps commander outnumbered more than 2 to 1, fighting on his own initiative without the direct supervision of the Emperor, producing a decisive result. Napoleon, receiving the reports that evening, initially found the account of Auerstedt implausible. Davout's force was too small to have defeated what it claimed to have defeated, and had to be shown the evidence before he finally accepted. He subsequently accorded Davout the formal honors due to the victory, but somewhat coolly so, since the scale of his marshal's independent success was in some tension with the narrative of the Napoleonic omnidirectional genius. The collapse of the Prussian resistance after Jena and Auerstedt was total and rapid. Fortresses that had been designed to hold for months surrendered within days, or even hours, as their commanders, receiving news of the field's army's destruction, concluded there was nothing to hold for. Stettin, with a garrison of 5,000, surrendered to a force of hussars numbering 800. The cavalry officer commanding, apparently improvising, sent a message demanding immediate surrender on pain of bombardment by artillery that was in fact not even present. The garrison complied, took the bluff. Magdeburg, defended by 24,000 troops, surrendered to a smaller French force. Within weeks, Napoleon was in Berlin, sleeping in Frederick the Great's bedroom at Potsdam, and he had sent an officer to remove the king's sword from the wall where it was displayed as a trophy. He is reported to have said, examining it, "I prefer the sword of a great man to a kingdom." The Prussian state, which had been the most feared military power in Europe a generation earlier, had effectively ceased to function in less than a month. Now, as for Russia, they were still in the field. The campaign that followed Jena extended into the bitter Polish winter, involving 2 brutal battles at Eylau in February and in Friedland in June. Well, Eylau was the nearest thing to a French defeat in the field since Napoleon had held supreme command, a grinding, bloody engagement in a snowstorm, in which both sides took enormous casualties and neither really achieved a decisive result. French losses were somewhere between 20 and 25,000. Russian losses were pretty much the same. Napoleon rode across the battlefield afterward, and by multiple accounts was shaken by what he saw. He was not yet 38 years old, and he'd been producing battles for 10 years. Eylau was the first in which the human cost was visible to him in a way that his usual vantage point had allowed him to avoid. He had a painting of Eylau commissioned from Gros, and requested it show the aftermath with its full horror. Whether this represented genuine moral feeling, or perhaps a calculated exercise in demonstrating his magnanimity, that's a question that admirers and critics will have to figure out for themselves. Friedland, in June 1807, was decisive, where Eylau had been indeterminate. Napoleon caught the Russian army with a river at its back, the Elba River, which had made retreat extremely difficult, of course, and he drove the army into the water, inflicting roughly 25,000 Russian casualties against the French losses of perhaps 8,000. Alexander requested an armistice. The conversations that followed on the raft at Tilsit were, by the accounts of those who observed from the shore, genuinely warm. Two young emperors, who were the two most powerful men in the world, recognizing each other as equals, in a way that neither could with any other living person. Alexander was 29. Napoleon was 37. Alexander reportedly said afterward that he had hated Napoleon before meeting him, but afterwards found it impossible to hate him. Napoleon, whose ability to charm one-on-one was legendary among people who had experienced it. It appears that he exerted himself to the fullest at Tilsit. Now, whether the warmth was real on Napoleon's side or just instrumental, well, that is a question that his correspondence with Josephine about the meeting, notably cooler in tone than his diplomatic dispatches, raises without settling. The treaties of Tilsit, signed in July of 1807, divided effective dominance of Europe between France and Russia. Alexander recognized Napoleon's reorganization of Western and Central Europe, accepted the French hegemony over the satellite kingdoms, and agreed to join the Continental system. Napoleon's economic blockade of Britain, which required European ports to refuse British goods. Well, in exchange, Napoleon acknowledged Russian interests in the East and gave Alexander a relatively free hand regarding the Ottoman Empire and Sweden. Prussia was stripped of roughly half its territory. Its Polish lands became the new Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a nominally independent state governed by the King of Saxony, that served as a demonstration of the possibility of Polish nationhood and a source of French-aligned troops. Its German territories west of the Elba became the new Kingdom of Westphalia, given to Napoleon's brother Jerome. Frederick William III, reduced to a rump state dependent on Russian goodwill for its survival, had attended the negotiations and received almost nothing. Napoleon had wanted to eliminate Prussia entirely. Alexander's intervention preserved it. It was one of the first moments in which a genuine conflict of interest between the two emperors was visible beneath the surface of their conspicuous display of personal warmth. Now let's talk a bit about the Continental system, the decree enforced from Berlin in November 1806 and extended through the subsequent ordinances that banned British goods from all ports under French control or allied to France. This was Napoleon's strategic response to the problem that Trafalgar had made permanent. You see, there was no way he was invading Britain now. He knew it. The British knew it. Everyone knew it. He could not destroy the Royal Navy. But he could, if the enforcement was sufficiently comprehensive, deny British exports access to their largest market. Britain's economy in the early 19th century was heavily dependent upon European trade. If the continent could be sealed, or British commerce would collapse, the government would face financial crisis, and so the theory ran, Britain would be forced to negotiate a peace that recognized French continental hegemony. The theory was economically coherent, sure. The problem is the enforcement. The system required every port and every coastline under French influence to turn away British ships and goods. This meant not just France itself, but the Dutch coastline, the German North Sea ports, the Italian peninsula, Iberian coast, and eventually the Baltic. It meant policing thousands of miles of shoreline against smugglers who were motivated by the enormous profits available to those who could move British goods into a continent that was starved of them. It also meant requiring allied and satellite states to bear the economic cost of refusing trade they needed. The Dutch economy was heavily dependent on maritime commerce. The Baltic ports lived on the export of naval stores to Britain, Danish merchants and the Hanseatic traders were being asked to destroy their own livelihoods for the benefit of French strategic calculation. The resentment this generated was real, and in political terms, destabilizing, producing exactly the kind of hostility to French hegemony that Napoleon needed to suppress while simultaneously fighting the wars that the system's failures were partly generating. Britain's response was partly in the orders in council, countermeasures that required neutral ships trading with France to call at British ports and pay duties, which generated its own diplomatic crisis, including the contributing to the War of 1812 with the United States, and partly a determined effort to find alternative markets in South America and the wider world that partially compensated for the loss of European trade. More importantly, Britain extended the war by other means. They subsidized Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Spain to keep on fighting, maintaining the Royal Navy's stranglehold on French colonial trade, and eventually supporting Wellington's campaign in Portugal and Spain, which, well, it all turned Napoleon's Iberian intervention into the draining multi-year commitment that became known as the Spanish Ulcer. The continental system damaged both sides. It didn't break Britain. It did break the patience of France's allies. Napoleon's intervention in Spain beginning in 1807 is the clearest demonstration of the specific form of strategic blindness that would eventually destroy him. Yes, we're halfway through the series, and this is basically one of the turning points. The inability to recognize that his methods, which worked reliably against conventional European armies and traditional European states, were practically useless against a population that refused to behave like a state. The opportunity seemed straightforward. Portugal was continuing to trade with Britain in defiance of the continental system. Spain, France's nominal ally, was governed by the weak and corrupt Bourbon monarchy of Charles IV, whose chief minister, Godoy, was widely despised, and who was embroiled in a dynastic conflict with his own son Ferdinand. Napoleon moved troops into Spain under the pretext of a Portuguese campaign, engineered a confrontation between Charles and Ferdinand, summoned them both to meet at Bayonne, pressured both into abdicating their claims to the Spanish throne, and placed his brother Joseph upon it. The whole operation took a few weeks, and appeared to be all complete. But the Spanish people did not accept it. On May 2nd, 1808, the population of Madrid rose against the French troops in the city. The Dos de Mayo uprising, painted in the images of savage violence by Goya, whose two great canvases of the uprising and aftermath remained among the most powerful anti-war paintings ever made. The uprising was suppressed with mass shootings. The suppressions generated just more uprisings. French forces that had entered Spain expecting a brief policing operation found themselves fighting the entire population of the country, organized into guerrilla bands, the partidas, that operated across a terrain of mountains and plains, ideally suited to hit-and-run warfare, and deeply hostile to any conventional military response. The French column sent to suppress one area would clear it at the cost of heavy casualties, move on, and find the area reoccupied the moment the column left. A supply convoy moving between cities required an escort that might outnumber the supplies it was protecting. A garrison left in a town might be cut off, starved, or attacked the moment the field army was occupied elsewhere. Now the word guerrilla, little war, entered European languages from this conflict. The practice it described was ancient. The systematic, population-wide application of it against a modern occupation army was new enough to lack effective countermeasures in the French military doctrine. Napoleon's army could concentrate, maneuver, and destroy another army, but couldn't really do much against an enemy that dispersed whenever concentrations appeared and reconstituted when they left. The Spanish regular armies were beaten repeatedly and reconstituted repeatedly, supplied through Portugal and ultimately through British-maintained ports like Cadiz. Never quite eliminated, despite losing every conventional engagement. Napoleon himself spent less than 4 months in Spain. He never returned after January of 1809, leaving the campaign to his marshals, who fought each other as much as they fought the Spanish and British, and who never achieved the coordination that might have resolved the situation. And so, that's why it's called the Spanish ulcer, the wound in the western flank that wouldn't heal, and that drained blood steadily for the next 6 years. Over the entire course of the Peninsular War, France would lose somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. And that's a figure that approaches the losses of the Russian campaign, and that was inflicted over 6 years by an enemy that France never once regarded as a primary strategic problem. The Spanish insurgency was never decisive in isolation. Combined with Wellington's army and the permanent drain it imposed, it was one of the 2 or 3 factors that really put the death blow on the empire. Arthur Wellesley, who would eventually become the Duke of Wellington, arrived in Portugal in 1808 with a British expeditionary force and began the campaign that would eventually carry him to Toulouse in Napoleon's first abdication. Wellesley's method was almost precisely the opposite of Napoleon's. When Napoleon sought the decisive engagement, the massed concentration and the killing blow that ended wars in weeks, Wellesley built supply systems, fortified positions, and refused battle, except on ground he had chosen for himself. His celebrated lines of Torres Vedras, a system of 152 fortified positions stretching across the Lisbon Peninsula, stopped Massena's 1810 to 1811 invasion of Portugal cold, exhausted the French army in front of them through starvation and disease, and forced a retreat that cost the French more than battles had. Wellesley understood that he was fighting a war of duration rather than decision. His army, supplied by sea and augmented by Spanish and Portuguese allies, could sustain itself indefinitely, while a French army, 1,000 miles from Paris, operating in hostile country with its supply lines constantly harassed, was just going to waste away. The strategy eventually worked, although it took 6 years, but hey, it worked. But in April 1809, Austria came back. They decided to try again. The War of the Fifth Coalition was launched with unusual energy by Austria under the reform-minded Archduke Charles, who had spent the years since Austerlitz rebuilding the Habsburg army along lines that addressed some structural weaknesses. The previous campaigns had exposed all this to him, and, it was time to make some changes. Charles crossed into Bavaria with 200,000 men, moving faster than previous Austrian armies and with better coordination between his corps. Napoleon, caught slightly off balance, rallied with his characteristic speed and drove the Austrians back in the Danube campaign with victories at Ebensburg, Landshut, and Eckmühl. By early May, he was at the Danube near Vienna, preparing to cross. The crossing on the Danube at Aspern-Essling on May 21st to 22nd, 1809, produced Napoleon's first clear defeat in a major field engagement. The initial crossing succeeded, and a significant French force, perhaps 35,000, established itself on the north bank at the villages of Aspern and Essling. Archduke Charles attacked with 95,000, and after 2 days of brutal fighting, in which the French held their positions but could not advance, rising river levels caused by rain and deliberately floated debris broke the bridges behind them, cutting off their supply and reinforcement. Napoleon was forced to withdraw to the island of Lobau in the middle of the Danube. Marshal Lannes, his oldest friend among the marshals and the man he trusted most in a crisis, was mortally wounded at Essling, and 2 days later he was dead. Napoleon reportedly sat with the dying Lannes for hours, deeply distressed, in a way that witnesses found to be striking. The emperor, who managed information about casualties so carefully that his soldiers joked that a bulletin admitting 10,000 French dead meant 40,000 actual deaths, in the presence of a personal loss was something closer to a grieving man. He spent 6 weeks on Lobau, reorganizing, resupplying, and building the pontoon infrastructure for a second crossing. The Battle of Wagram, on July 5 to 6, 1809, was on a scale that dwarfed Austerlitz. Nearly 300,000 men engaged over 2 days, across a front of 12 miles. Wagram was not a masterpiece. It was a controlled application of overwhelming force. Huge artillery concentrations, the largest single battery that was ever assembled, battering the Austrian centre until it broke. Archduke Charles, who had fought his army with a considerable skill, was unable to sustain the pressure and requested an armistice. The Peace of Schönbrunn stripped Austria of Illyria, Salzburg, western Galicia, and a significant additional territory, reducing the Habsburg Empire to its smallest extent in generations. Napoleon reinforced the diplomatic settlement by divorcing Josephine, which had not produced an heir, and marrying Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian Emperor Francis I in April 1810. The birth of a son in March 1811 immediately gave the title King of Rome. It appeared to complete the dynastic project. By 1810 to 1811, the French Empire and its dependencies covered more of Europe than any single power since Rome. The empire proper included France in its natural frontiers, Belgium, the Netherlands, the Rhineland, and large portions of northern Italy. Surrounding it was a ring of satellite kingdoms, Spain under Joseph Bonaparte, perpetually insecure, perpetually at war, the Kingdom of Naples under Murat, the Kingdom of Westphalia under Jerome, the Kingdom of Italy under Eugene de Beauharnais, the Confederation of the Rhine, comprising most of the German states not under direct French rule, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw gesturing at the possibility of Polish national restoration. Switzerland was a French-aligned confederation, Denmark a French ally. Sweden had recently elected one of Napoleon's marshals, Bernadotte, as its crown prince, though Bernadotte would eventually fight against France, which is the kind of outcome that made Napoleon occasionally regret his habit of dispensing kingdoms. Sometimes it backfires, I suppose. Napoleon himself, at the zenith of 1810 to 11, was a different figure from the first council of 1800. He'd put on weight. The lean, hollowed look of his Italian campaign portraits gave way to something a little rounder and less aesthetic. His court had become increasingly formal, increasingly distant from the meritocratic energy of the early consulate. Courtiers prostrated themselves, audiences were conducted with rigid protocol, and ministers who brought bad news found increasingly that it was safer to bring filtered versions of the truth. The problems of accurate information reaching him, which had been manageable when he was personally present at the theatres of battle, could assess things himself, well, now it was becoming acute, as the empire's scale made personal presence impossible everywhere at once. In 1810, he was 41 years old, with a new young Austrian wife, a newborn son, and an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Russian border. He was, in ways that those closest to him were beginning to notice, more prone to error than the younger man had been. He was slower to absorb information that challenged his existing plans, quicker to dismiss expert advice that contradicted his preferences, more inclined to substitute his will for the situation's actual requirements. The qualities that had made him extraordinary at 26 were becoming liabilities at 41. He was, by any estimation, the most powerful man in the world, but he was about to make the worst decision of his entire life. The administrative reality of the empire was considerably more complicated than the map suggested. Joseph Bonaparte in Spain had been given a kingdom that actively refused to recognize him, whose countryside was controlled by guerrilla warfare fighters, whose nobility mostly sided with the Bourbons, and whose population had been radicalized by the combination of being occupied and the religious dimensions of anti-French resistance. Now, just quickly, the Spanish church, unlike the French church after the Concordat, remained genuinely hostile to Napoleon. And if you haven't got the church on your side, well, you're in a bit of trouble. Jerome in Westphalia spent his brief reign in the kind of extravagant personal expenditure that gave the satellite kingdoms a bad name and generated the specific joke, widely circulated, that the purpose of Napoleon's family was to demonstrate that talent was not hereditary. Murat in Naples was capable, but he was independent-minded, and his ultimate loyalty to the Bonaparte family would prove, well, conditional on his personal survival. Correctly, as events would show. The system functioned when Napoleon's personal authority was visibly intact. It was designed functionally around one man. But beneath the dominance on the map, the fractures were multiplying. The continental system was breeding hostility across the continent. Merchants and manufacturers who depended on British trade, the Baltic states, whose economics ran on the export of timber and naval stores, the Dutch shippers whose livelihood was maritime commerce, all of them were being asked to bear concrete economic pain for the benefit of the French. It doesn't sound like a very good deal. They weren't really getting that much in return, and ultimately, the people were suffering. The German states within the Confederation of the Rhine were providing troops for French campaigns, paying contributions, hosting French garrisons, and beginning to develop something that had not previously existed in a recognizable form. It was a German national consciousness, partly generated by the Romantic movement, partly by the very experience of French occupation, which provided a vivid demonstration of what German identity meant by showing Germans what they were not. Philosophers like Fichte were writing addresses to the German nation. Poets and historians were excavating a German past that was fascinating and whipping up patriotism. The occupation that was supposed to bring enlightenment rationalism to backward dynastic states was producing in reaction the first stirrings of the nationalist politics that would eventually redraw Europe more thoroughly than Napoleon could have ever done himself. The relationship with Alexander I, whose signature at Tilsit had provided the eastern boundary of the French hegemony, that was by this point deteriorating. Russia had agreed to the continental system reluctantly, and was not enforcing it with progressively less enthusiasm as the economic costs became politically unstable. You see, Russia needed to export grain and timber, and they needed British imports in return, so they were suffering too. By 1810 to 11, Russian ports were quietly admitting British goods under neutral flags, and Alexander had indicated that Russia would not accept Napoleon's annexation of the Duchy of Oldenburg, a small German territory whose ruling house was related to the Romanovs. The annexation of Oldenburg was not in itself consequential. What it represented was Napoleon's compulsive need to close every gap in the continental system. Every little loophole, every little exception. It was pushing him to actions that accumulated into a pattern of encroachment, and his allies could definitely not absorb it. So by late 1811, both sides were preparing for a war that neither had yet formally decided to fight. The Grande Armée that crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory on June 24, 1812, was the largest military force assembled in European history to that point. Contemporary estimates gave it somewhere between 450 to 600,000 men, and that range reflects the genuine uncertainty. How are you meant to count the various national contingents? You had Germans, Polish, Italian, Austrian, Prussian. They all marched alongside the French corps. This was not, however, the battle-hardened army of Austerlitz. It had been diluted. Years of campaigning in Spain, replenished with conscripts who didn't really have any experience. It wasn't like the old guard. The veteran classes were sorely outnumbered, and its cavalry horses were already in poor condition before the campaign even began. Napoleon was aware of all this. He had calculated that Alexander, faced with this mass, would rather negotiate rather than fight. The problem was, he miscalculated. Alexander was going to do the opposite. The Russian strategy, which emerged partly from calculation and partly from the collapse of Russian attempts to hold successive defensive positions, was first to retreat. The armies under Barclay de Tolly and Bagration fell back before the French advance, fighting rearguard actions that inflicted casualties, but refused the decisive engagement that Napoleon was seeking. The vast distances of Russia, which had appeared on the planning maps as the space between two frontiers, revealed themselves in practice as the force that was going to consume the Grand Army without a battle. Horses dying of heat and poor forage on the Lithuanian plains, men falling to dysentery and typhus in the swamps, supply columns stretched across hundreds of miles of bad road and unable to keep pace with an advance that covered 40 miles a day. The army that crossed the Niemen in late June was already sufficiently smaller by the time it reached Smolensk in mid-August. It had not even yet engaged the main Russian force, but so many men were gone. The sheer logistical calculation of what Napoleon was attempting was staggering. An army of 500,000, and their horses, well, that requires something like 3,000 tons of food and fodder every single day, not to mention clean water. Well, in Western Europe, this could be sourced through a combination of local procurement, organized supply trains running on reasonable roads, and the relatively dense population of friendly or cowed territory. Problem was, they were in Russia now, and that offered none of those things. The distances were enormous. The roads were either poor or non-existent. The Russian scorched earth retreat policy removed whatever food the land had produced, and the population, they were very hostile. Napoleon had planned to fight a short and sharp campaign, and supply it from conquered territory, as he supplied previous campaigns. The territory he was conquering had nothing left to give him. By the time the Grand Army reached Smolensk in August, it had lost roughly 100,000 men, perhaps 80,000 horses to heat, disease, and exhaustion, and it had fought pretty much no one. The Battle of Borodino, September 7, 1812, was the decisive engagement Napoleon had been seeking, and was not, in the end, what he needed. The Russian army under Kutuzov, who had replaced the cautious Barclay, chose a position on the Borodino field and fought. The battle lasted the entire day. 250,000 men engaged across a front of 8 miles, producing some of the highest casualties of any single day's fighting in European history. Roughly 70,000 French and Allied casualties, perhaps 45,000 Russian. The French took the main Russian positions. The Russians withdrew in good order, rather than breaking. Kutuzov had preserved his army. Napoleon had won the field, but not the war. During the battle, he held his Imperial Guard. The reserve in the previous engagement had delivered decisive blows, in place behind the lines. His subordinates urged its commitment at several critical moments, but each time he refused, later explaining he would not risk his last reserve of 800 leagues from France. Well, the caution was rational, I suppose. It was also on a battlefield where the Russian army was under enormous pressure, possibly the decision that allowed Kutuzov to withdraw. Moscow fell on September 14th, 1812. Napoleon rode in expecting surrender negotiations, the formal submission of Russia's ancient capital that would compel Alexander to the peace table. But when he got there, the city was largely empty. The Russian governor, Rostochin, had ordered an evacuation of the population and had prepared for the city's destruction. Within hours of the French entry, fires broke out across Moscow, destroying 3/4 of the city's buildings and most of its food stores. Whether Rostochin ordered the fires, or they were the result of individual acts of sabotage and accident, is disputed. Some accounts credit a deliberate incendiary plan, others suggest a more spontaneous breakdown. Well, the outcome was the same. Napoleon sat there in a burning city, 5 weeks' march from his nearest supply base, waiting for Alexander to negotiate. And Alexander did not negotiate. He retreated to his estates and waited the starving Frenchmen out. Napoleon waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, sending 3 separate overtures to Alexander and receiving no response. When he finally ordered the retreat on October 19, 1812, the Russian winter was beginning. The Grand Army that left Moscow numbered perhaps 100,000, plus perhaps 50,000 more in garrisons and rear guards along the route. It was following the same road it had come by, stripped of supplies during the advance, and now offering nothing but burned villages and exhausted land. Kutuzov shadowed it, striking at the flanks and the rear, avoiding pitched battle, but ensuring that any soldier who fell out of the column was killed by Cossacks within hours. The temperature dropped to -20 or 30 Celsius by November. The horses died first. Without horses, they couldn't move the artillery, which meant they just had to abandon it. Well, that also meant the columns were progressively stripped of the capacity to defend themselves against regular attack. The men began dying in numbers that were not from battle but from cold and hunger and exhaustion, and the simple cumulative effect of being a European soldier in conditions for which nothing in European military experience provided preparation for. The crossing of the Berezina River on November 26 to 29 became a symbol of the retreat's horror. The bridge had been destroyed. The French engineers built 2 new ones across a freezing river, while Russian armies closed in from multiple directions, and the crossing took 3 days of desperate fighting to hold the bridgehead, while the army and its massive column of camp followers, wounded, and stragglers tried to get across. Tens of thousands, who would not make it across in time, were captured or killed when the bridges were burned. The survivors who staggered across the Niemen and back into Poland in December numbered something between 90 and 100,000 out of the 500,000 or more that had crossed going out the other way in June. Precise figures are uncertain, but the scale isn't. Napoleon had led the largest army in European history into Russia, and he returned with perhaps 1 in 5 men. Napoleon left the wreckage of his army December 5, 1812, transferring command to Murat and traveling back to Paris at maximum speed, covering the 1,400 miles in 13 days, traveling through Germany in disguise to avoid the news of the disaster reaching European capitals before he did. He arrived in Paris on December 18th and immediately began planning the reconstruction of his forces. The speed of his response was characteristic and genuine. He had absorbed the catastrophe, calculated what remained, and was already moving to replace what had been lost. In the spring of 1813, he would field a new army of 350,000, drawn from conscript classes called up early, from National Guard units converted to line service, from satellite kingdoms, everywhere really. Every available source was tapped. The organizational capacity this represented was remarkable. The quality of the new army was not what the old one had been. The specific deficit that could not be replaced in time was cavalry. The horses of the Grand Army had died in Russia in their tens of thousands, whether that be cold, starvation, or exhaustion, or of being ridden on roads of ice until they fell and just didn't get up again. Poor horses, though, eh? Never really talk about that. Poor things. Well, breeding and training a replacement cavalry force, that was going to take years, not months. The new army Napoleon was building in early 1813 would fight the campaigns of Germany with a cavalry arm so diminished that it could not adequately screen its own movements. It could not pursue a beaten enemy to destruction, and it could not conduct a long-range reconnaissance mission, the ones that allowed Napoleon in previous campaigns to know what the enemy was doing and where they were. This single deficit would cost him the ability to convert tactical victories into decisive strategic results that had characterized his earlier campaigns. Sure, he would win battles in the spring of 1813 and find that the enemy was still in the field a week later, reconstituted because he lacked the cavalry to pursue them. The Russia campaign had destroyed not just an army, but the specific operational tool that had made the army's victories permanent. The deeper damage from Russia could not be repaired, at least not with organizational capacity. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was broken. For 12 years, every major continental power that had challenged Napoleon on the battlefield had been defeated, often annihilated. Austria had been beaten in 1797, 1800, and 1809. Prussia had been effectively destroyed as a military power in 1806. Russia had been brought to the peace table in 1807. The accumulated effect of these defeats had been a paralysis of will in the courts of Europe, a sense that confronting Napoleon was simply what powers did before they were beaten, and that getting beaten was inevitable. Well, of course, the Russian campaign had shattered this. Alexander had not submitted. The Russian army had not broken at Borodino. The winter and the distance had done what Austrian and Prussian armies had failed to do. Every monarch in Europe who had signed humiliating treaties providing troops for French campaigns and watched their territory reorganized to suit French convenience, being replaced by a Bonapartist governor. All of them were now looking at the Nieman's Crossing outcome, and they were drawing an obvious conclusion. Among the observers drawing conclusions was a Prussian officer named Karl von Clausewitz, who had served in the 1806 campaign, been captured at Jena, spent years in Prussian military reform work alongside Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and participated in the Russian campaign as a liaison officer. He was in the process of writing what would become On War, the most important work of military theory in Western history, published posthumously in 1832. Well, and the Russia campaign provided the material that drove his central argument, that war is a continuation of politics by other means, that military force exists in service of political objectives, and that the failure to keep those two things properly connected produces the kind of catastrophic overextension that happened in Russia. Napoleon, Clausewitz argued, had elevated the military instrument to a point where it had swallowed the political purpose it was supposed to serve. The Grand Empire had become self-perpetuating. It required new wars to sustain the political and economic structures of previous ones, until the instrument itself gave way and broke. The analysis is devastating, and in the judgment of most historians who have examined it, pretty much correct. And yeah, it is pretty much correct. The coalition forming in early 1813 would be different from its predecessors in both scale and determination. Prussia switched sides in 1813, its army rebuilt through the reform program that Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Clausewitz had developed since Jena. These professional reforms and mobilization of Prussian nationalism would produce one of the most effective armies of the next decade. Russia was battered, but it still had intact forces, and they were moving west. Austria was negotiating, with Metternich's characteristic patience, for the best price it could extract for its eventual alignment with the anti-French coalition. Sweden, under the former Marshal Bernadotte, had joined against France. Britain's subsidies were flowing to every government willing to fight. The catastrophe in Russia had done more than destroy an army. Ultimately, now Europe was convinced that Napoleon could be beaten, and the European powers, for the first time, were going to join up and test that theory together. But you're going to have to wait until part 3 for that, when it all falls apart. So what do you think? Spoiler alert, Napoleon dies at the end. Well, it's been 200 years, so whatever, it's okay to spoil it now. Thank you so much for listening. I have been your host, and you know where I'll be for part 3, right here on YouTube, or perhaps you're listening on Patreon. Thank you to those supporting the channel, keeping us crowd-funded and independent, and thank you to those who liked, subscribed, did all that good stuff. I'm going to cook myself dinner. Good night. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to part 3 of our series on the Napoleonic Wars. I hope you've had a good time over the 3 parts of this series and learned a bit following along with the playlist. Thank you once again to those keeping us ad-free and crowd-funded by supporting via those links in the pinned comment and description, and thank you for liking and subscribing to help push us out in the algorithm. Let's keep going from where we were last time. In the spring of 1815, a British officer stationed in the south of France sent a dispatch to London reporting an extraordinary rumor that the man exiled to Elba had escaped. The Corsican ogre has bolted, ran the first reports. The monster has landed at Cannes. Bonaparte is advancing on Grenoble Napoleon entered Lyon yesterday, and finally, after 2 weeks, as the man moved north through France, and the army sent him to stop him, defected regiment by regiment, his shako waved on bayonet tips in the air. His Majesty, the Emperor, arrived at the Tuileries last night. Not a shot had been fired. Louis XVIII, the restored Bourbon king, had fled. The most powerful coalition in European history had spent 2 years defeating Napoleon, and he had undone their work in 20 days by just walking home. The 100 days that followed his return, well, the final desperate gamble of a man who lost everything and understood that everything was the only bet worth making, it all ended at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, on a ridge in Belgium, where Wellington's army held its positions through the longest afternoon in the history of European warfare, and the Prussians arrived at dusk on the French right flank. The Imperial Guard broke, the army collapsed, and Napoleon was finished, finally and permanently, with the kind of completeness that 20 years of nearly continuous warfare had somehow failed to produce. So today's part 3. We cover the end, the catastrophic retreat from Russia into the campaigns of Germany and France, the first fall, the brief extraordinary restoration, the final defeat, the exile that lasted until his death, the question of what it all meant, what it left behind. So as you picture in your head Napoleon marching back home, ready to take what was his, let's bring our memory back to an exhausted empire. What happened on December 18th, 1812? That was the day that Napoleon arrived back in Paris, having covered 1,400 miles in 13 days from the wreckage of his army. He immediately began organizing the reconstruction of the French military power on the same focused energy that he had brought to every previous crisis. New conscript classes were called up early. National Guard units were converted to regular service. Horses were requisitioned from farms and coach companies. The organizational effort was really remarkable. By the spring of 1813, he had assembled a new army that on paper approached the size of the forces he had taken to Russia, but the paper concealed the problem. The soldiers his officers were training in the winter of 1812-13 were, in the language of the French army, the Merry Louise, named with gentle contempt for the young emperors, implying that they were young enough to still need mothering. The oldest men in the new classes were 19 or 20. They'd never fought. The veterans who had survived the Russian catastrophe were distributed among the new formations to provide what experienced backbone could be managed. But the ratio was impossible. There were just not enough chiefs and too many Indians, forgive the terminology. They couldn't provide what was needed. There were not enough veterans to leave in 200,000 raw conscripts into the quality of combat experience that previous French armies had possessed. And more critically, the cavalry and the horses, the instrument whose absence had cost Napoleon his ability to convert tactical success into strategic decision in 1813, could not be replaced on any achievable timeline. Breeding and training cavalry horses took years, too. Napoleon would fight the campaigns of 1813 in Germany with a serious deficit of the arm that had made his victories permanent and decisive. France itself was exhausted in a way that went beyond the military. 20 years of revolutionary and Napoleonic warfare had consumed men, money, and the patience of a population that had borne enormous sacrifices for enormous victories, fair enough. But now they faced enormous sacrifices for a situation that increasingly looked like survival rather than triumph. The game was no longer worth the candle. The Continental system had damaged French commerce as well as British. The satellite kingdoms were resentful and unreliable. The tax base had been stretched to its limit. The senators and ministers who had applauded Napoleon's every move in the years of triumph were now beginning to quietly calculate in private conversations what France's position would look like if the wars went on indefinitely, or, heaven forbid, if they lost. This private calculation among the political class, invisible to anyone reading Napoleon's public communiques, was one of the most important realities of the period, and the one he was least equipped to assess accurately, because the court culture he had built around himself had progressively filtered out information that might disturb him. In February 1813, Prussia switched sides. Its army rebuilt through the reform program that Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Clausewitz had developed since Jena. More professional at every level, more capable of sustained operations, drawing on the mobilization of Prussian national feeling that the experience of occupation had generated. The alliance of Prussia and Russia formed the core around which Britain's subsidies and Sweden's army, under the former Marshal Bernadotte, would aggregate, who had accepted the Swedish crown and was now fighting his former emperor with the specific thoroughness of a man who needed to demonstrate he had fully chosen his new country. Austria was negotiating. They were watching carefully, ultimately calculating whether Napoleon could be pressured into territorial concessions, or whether he would have to be destroyed. Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister, offered to mediate, and the offer was genuine, in the sense that the foreign minister of Austria genuinely preferred a negotiated outcome that restored the balance of power to the expense of another massive war. Napoleon's response to the mediation overture was, in retrospect, one of his most consequential decisions. There was a famous meeting in Metternich in Dresden, June 1813. Napoleon rejected the terms on offer. Essentially, a return to France's natural frontiers, the abandonment of satellite kingdoms, and a European settlement that would have left him Emperor of France, sure, but not of Europe. Harsh terms, very harsh, at least for Napoleon, but they were also achievable, and accepting them would have preserved the empire. Napoleon reportedly told Metternich that he could not make such a peace, that his position required victory, that a compromise peace that acknowledged limits was indistinguishable from a defeat. He is reported, though the account comes from Metternich's own memoirs and requires the usual ounce of caution, to have said, quote, "A man like me does not concern himself with the lives of 1,000,000 men." End quote. Well, I hope the men don't hear that. Metternich, by his own account, picked up his hat and left the room. Austria declared war in August. The armistice that had allowed Napoleon to consolidate after the spring victories ended. The full coalition was now assembled. The autumn campaign produced a pattern that was becoming familiar. Napoleon winning individual engagements, while unable to prevent the overall strategic encirclement. At Dresden, in late August, he inflicted a significant defeat on Schwarzenberg's coalition army, killing or capturing around 38,000 men. But his subordinate commanders, operating without his presence, were losing battles elsewhere. Vandamme was surrounded and captured at Coup. MacDonald was beaten at the Katzbach, Oudinot at the Grossbeeren. The coalition had adopted the Trachenberg plan, avoid battle with Napoleon himself, while attacking his marshals aggressively. They recognized that the French system depended on Napoleon's personal direction, and that his subordinates without him were considerably less formidable. a lucid assessment, and it worked. By October, every approach to Leipzig was converging. In the spring campaign of 1813, Napoleon showed that his tactical genius had certainly survived the Russian catastrophe intact. At Lutzen in May and Bautzen in late May, he defeated the combined Prussian and Russian forces with the new army, demonstrating he could still read a battlefield and get the job done, maneuver inferior forces to tactical advantages against numerically superior ones. Both battles were victorious, but neither was really decisive, because he lacked the cavalry to pursue and complete the destruction of the beaten armies, which retreated in good order, and within weeks were completely reconstituted. This was the specific problem the Russian campaign's horse losses had created. Napoleon could win battles, but he couldn't exploit them into this campaign-ending annihilation. The things that had characterized Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland back in the good old days, that is. The enemy just kept coming back. The Battle of Leipzig on October 1813, fought over 4 days from October 16th to the 19th, involving somewhere between 450,000 and 530,000 combatants across a front that stretched around the city on 3 sides, was the largest single military engagement in European history before the First World War. Napoleon held the city against converging coalition armies of the north, east, and south, defeating each separate attack, while unable to break out of the encirclement. On October 18th, the Saxon and Württemberg contingents, fighting alongside the French, switched sides mid-battle. Several entire divisions simply turned their guns around and began firing in the other direction, which gives you a compressed demonstration of the reliability of Allied contingents who were fighting for Napoleon under compulsion rather than conviction. On October 19th, the bridge over the Elster River was blown prematurely, while 30,000 French troops were on the city's side, stranding them. That was the main escape route. The French army retreated west, having suffered perhaps 73,000 casualties. The coalition's losses were comparable, but it had won. Germany was lost. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed, the satellite kingdoms east of the Rhine began to unravel, and Napoleon was fighting his way back to France. The campaign Napoleon fought in France in the first 3 months of 1814 is, by the judgment of many military historians, the most tactically brilliant of his career, and the one that clearly demonstrates the gap between tactical brilliance and strategic salvation. With 60 to 80,000 men fighting on French soil against coalition armies totaling more than 200,000 that were converging on Paris from multiple directions, he inflicted a series of sharp defeats that should by any reasonable calculation have been impossible. Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Vauchamp, 4 battles in 5 days in February of 1814, using the strategy of the central position that he had employed in Italy in 1796, moving faster than the enemy could coordinate, striking one corps before the adjacent corps could support it, routing it, and moving immediately to the next. At Montmirail, in February 11th, he defeated a Russian corps of 17,000, with 12,000 of his own men. At Vauchamp, the following day, he attacked another Russian corps, destroyed 4,000 of them, captured General Sacken's baggage too. Wellington, reviewing these operations from the peninsula, wrote to a colleague that Napoleon in February 1814 showed more genius than he had ever displayed in the preceding 5 years. The compliment was not empty. These were masterclasses in economy of force. No one can deny that. But they didn't save France, because the strategic arithmetic was irresolvable. Napoleon could defeat individual coalition corps faster than they could concentrate. He could not defeat 200,000 men. When he struck, the Prussians enforced them back. The Austrians and Russians were advancing elsewhere. When he turned to deal with those, the Prussians reconstituted and moved again. He was buying time without having a plausible end for the time he bought. Well, the coalition commanders understood all that too. Blucher, fighting alongside the Russians, wrote to his wife that watching Napoleon maneuver with his shrunken force against such odds was the most remarkable thing he had seen in decades of warfare, and then resumed his advances, because the mathematics, however astonishing the man performing them, remained unchanged. At several points in the campaign, the coalition commanders offered negotiations that would have preserved Napoleon as Emperor of France on approximately the boundaries of 792, and he rejected each approach, calculating or hoping that one more decisive victory would change the terms. Well, the victories came, sure, but the terms didn't change. The coalition had learned at Leipzig that Napoleon's tactical victories, however spectacular they were, did not need to be answered with strategic concession. They just needed to be survived. This was a game of attrition now. Well, Paris fell on March 30, 1814. Coalition forces entered the city, the first time a foreign army had been in Paris since the English had occupied it in 1420, nearly 400 years earlier. The Tsar of Russia rode through the streets of Paris to considerable popular curiosity, but no violence. Alexander had been explicit that he was making war on Napoleon, not on the French people. Napoleon, receiving the news at Fontainebleau, was told by his marshals that the army would not march to retake the capital. Ney, who had distinguished himself at Borodino and a dozen other battles, and who Napoleon had called the bravest of the brave, basically sat Napoleon down and told him it was all over. The immediate trigger had been the defection of Marshal Marmont, whose corps had gone over to the Allies on April 4th, while negotiations were still nominally ongoing. A piece of betrayal so precisely timed that it stripped Napoleon of any remaining argument that the army was behind him. Marmont's decision haunted him for the rest of his life. In his St. Helena conversations, he spoke of Marmont with a specific, contained bitterness he did not apply to Ney, whose later betrayals he seems to have found a bit more comprehensible. The marshals who gathered at Fontainebleau had made the calculation that the institutional survival of France, and their own survival with it, required an end to the war. And they were right. Dead right. In the narrow sense that means accurate assessment of available options, I suppose. Napoleon refused to acknowledge the assessment for 3 days. Very stubborn. But after those 3 days, he came to his senses. He abdicated. The terms of the first abdication, the Treaty of Fontainebleau, gave Napoleon sovereignty over the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean island of about 12,000 people off the Tuscan coast, with the title of Emperor retained, a personal guard of 1,000 men, and an annual income of 2 million francs to be paid by France. He was 44 at the time, physically intact, and in possession of the full tactical intelligence that allowed him to conduct the brilliant campaign of France against overwhelming numbers. Giving him an island to govern, 1,100 kilometers from Paris, with a guard and no restrictions on movement, would prove to be one of the less considered actions on the coalition powers' behalf. The Congress of Vienna, that convened in September of 1814 to redraw the map of Europe, was the most significant diplomatic gathering since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and it was conducted in an atmosphere of unusual social intensity. Every crowned head of consequence was present or represented. Balls and entertainments ran continuously alongside negotiations, and the Austrian foreign minister, Prince Metternich, reportedly managed his diplomatic work in the margins of social engagements with a stamina that impressed even those who found his politics infuriating. The Prince de Ligne, an elderly Austrian field marshal, who was present throughout, made the famous observation that, quote, "The Congress dances, but it does not progress," a remark that captured the entertainment but missed the substance. Well, the Congress did make remarkable progress, we have to say that much. It simply just made it slowly and contentiously. The central problem was what to do with the territories that Napoleon had redistributed. The restoration of every pre-Napoleonic boundary was neither practical nor desirable. Some of the states that existed before 1792 were no longer existing in any meaningful sense. Their populations had been reorganized, their institutions transformed, and restoring them would dismantle arrangements that had taken years to build, and that in some cases were more functional than what they replaced. The great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, each had territorial interests they were determined to protect, and territorial gains they were equally determined to secure. Talleyrand, representing the restored Bourbon monarchy of France, and thus formally among the defeated powers, managed through a combination of legal argument and diplomatic agility to insert France into the negotiations as a participant rather than a subject, arguing that the France of Louis XVIII was not the France of Napoleon and should be treated as a conquered state. His success in this maneuver was one of the more remarkable diplomatic achievements of the era. Napoleon, on Elba, was watching all of this with precise attention. He maintained a network of informants and received regular news of what was happening on the mainland. What he saw was a coalition that had begun to fracture along the fault lines of competing interests. Prussia and Russia quarreled with Britain and Austria over Poland and Saxony, producing a near crisis in January of 1815 that briefly made European war among the victors a real possibility. He heard that Louis XVIII's restoration was generating frustration in France, among soldiers who had been demobilized and stripped of the preferments that they had earned, among officers who had fought for 20 years and now found themselves under the command of returned émigré nobles whose last military experience was in a different century, among a population that found the Bourbon court culture after Napoleonic glamour distinctly anticlimactic. Well, it didn't help that he had heard that the annuity France had promised him was not being paid. Yeah, that's a big deal. He assessed the situation with the clarity he'd always brought to decisive calculations, and he concluded that the moment was right. He sailed from Elba on February 26, 1815, with a force of 1,100 men and 4 small cannons. The march from the landing at Golfe Juan in south of France to Paris is one of the most extraordinary episodes we have in this series. Extraordinary precisely because it was not military. Napoleon's 1,100 men were never going to fight their way to Paris against tens of thousands of French troops available to the Bourbon government. It was more of a political gamble, not a military one, that the French army, the officer corps, the men who had served him for 20 years and who felt displaced and humiliated by the Bourbon restoration, would choose him over Louis, or when the choice was presented in person. At Grenoble, a regiment sent to stop him advanced with its muskets lowered. Napoleon dismounted, walked forward alone, opened his coat, and said, Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, you recognize me. If any of you would shoot your emperor, here I am." Well, the regiment grounded its muskets. Its colonel attempted a brief protest. Napoleon embraced him. The regiment fell in behind him. But this scene, with variations, repeated itself all the way along the road to Paris. Marshal Ney, who had told Napoleon in March 1814 that the army would not march who had sworn loyalty to Louis XVIII, had promised the Bourbon government that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, ended up joining him at Auxerre with his entire corps. Seems like he was just talking tough, Louis XVIII's government dissolved around him as the ministers calculated their options and the army refused to fight. On March 20th, 1815, Napoleon entered Tuileries. The Bourbon court had left in such haste that dinner was apparently still warm on the table. The coalition powers at Vienna, receiving the news of the escape, and then the return in a sequence that compressed several weeks of diplomatic catastrophe into a matter of days, issued a declaration that Napoleon Bonaparte was an outlaw, an enemy of Europe, excluded from civil and social relations. They declared war unanimously and mobilized a coalition of roughly 700,000. Napoleon's position in the 100 Days was in some respects structurally stronger than it had been at any point since 1812. He had the army, the emotional loyalty of France's military class, and a concentrated force capable of striking before the coalition could fully assemble. In other respects, it was weaker than it had ever been. The population at large was profoundly war-weary. Everybody was sick of it. They just wanted normal lives at this point. The political liberals whose support he needed had accepted the additional act to the Constitution, a liberalizing document that Napoleon found personally distasteful but politically necessary, since his political base in 1815 included people who had spent the previous years developing opinions about constitutional governance. Well, he did this with the enthusiasm, of people doing something that they felt they had to do, rather than something that they wanted to. Benjamin Constant, the liberal theorist, who had been one of the most articulate critics of Napoleonic authoritarianism, now found himself writing constitutional documents for the emperor he had recently denounced, reasoning that a constitutional Napoleon was better than a Bourbon restoration. His reputation never fully recovered from the flip-flopping. The Vendée was in royalist revolt in the west before the Waterloo campaign even began. He had perhaps 90 days before the full weight of the coalition would be deployed against him. His only viable strategy was to attack before that was ready. The Waterloo campaign of June 1815 was Napoleon's most urgent and least measured. He had, in Belgium, 2 allied armies that had not yet concentrated: Wellington's Anglo-Dutch force of about 100,000 and Blücher's Prussian army of around 117,000. Together they outnumbered him decisively, but separately he could potentially defeat each of them before the other could intervene. On June 15th, he crossed the Sambre River and drove into the gap between the 2 armies, forcing the crisis before Wellington had fully assembled his force and before the Prussians had completed their concentration. The operational concept was classic Napoleon. The execution, over the following 3 days, was not. At Ligny, on June 16th, Napoleon defeated Blücher's Prussian army. Roughly 68,000 engaged against 84,000, inflicting some 16,000 casualties and forcing a Prussian retreat. A genuine victory, and it should have been more. Marshal Ney, commanding the French left wing at Quatre Bras, a few miles away, failed to prevent Wellington's concentration, and failed to send the corps that could have closed the trap on Blucher's retreating army. The First Corps under Toulon marched between two battles all day, received two conflicting orders from Napoleon and Ney, arriving at neither in time to be really effective. And effectively they spent the day covering ground without fighting, just walking back and forth. What a waste. The miscommunication between Napoleon and Ney at Quatre Bras and Ligny has been analyzed by military historians for 200 years without a real resolution. At some point, the accumulation of subordinate failures reflects on the command system that produced them. Wellington chose his ground at Waterloo, with the care he had always brought to defensive positions. The ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, south of the village of Waterloo, gave him a reverse slope on which to shelter his infantry from artillery fire, fortified positions at Huemont on his right, La Haye-Saint at the centre, and Papillon on his left, and a clear line of sight to the approaches from the south. He had been promised by Blucher that the Prussians would march to his support as early as possible, and his strategy was to hold the ridge until they arrived, a strategy whose success depended entirely on whether Blucher could move his battered army fast enough, and whether Wellington's own army could endure the punishment it would take in the meantime. Wellington's army was not what he would have chosen. It was a mixed force of British veterans, inexperienced British battalions, Dutch and Belgian troops of varying quality and questionable loyalty, and German contingents of mixed reputation. An infamous army, he wrote to a colleague, quote, very weak and ill-equipped, and very inexperienced staff, end quote. Well, he said it to the colleague, not the army, of course. On the day he needed them, most of them held, so, hey, I suppose they proved him wrong. Napoleon delayed his attack on the morning of June 18, waiting for the ground to dry after overnight rain so his artillery could maneuver more effectively. The delay, roughly 3 to 4 hours beyond what a dawn attack would have permitted, gave the Prussians a bit of time on their own. The assault on Huguemont, intended as a diversion to pull Wellington's reserves toward his right, instead consumed an entire French division, as the garrison of the fortified farm, primarily British guards, held against the repeated assault throughout the day. The attackers got through the gate briefly at one point. A corporal named Fraser and several companions pushed it closed again, and the farm held. Huguemont did not fall. The Grand Battery, Napoleon's mass artillery deployment of over 200 guns, opened a 2-hour bombardment of Wellington's position at midday. The effect was diminished by the reverse slope. Much of the French fire passed over the heads of the infantry sheltering behind a ridge. Ney's infantry assault in the early afternoon hit Wellington's centre hard. Came close to breaking through, too, when La Haye-Saint fell in the mid-afternoon and was repulsed. Then, Ney, apparently interpreting the movement of some of Wellington's units behind the ridge as the beginning of a retreat, when in fact they were just shifting to avoid casualties, ordered a cavalry attack without infantry or artillery support. 17,000 cavalry in repeated charges swept up to the Allied squares, broke against them, reformed, and charged again. The squares held. The French cavalry suffered enormous losses to almost no effect. Wellington's army was battered and stretched, sure, but it did not break. By early evening, the Prussians were arriving on Napoleon's right flank in growing numbers. Blucher had driven his exhausted men through mud at a pace that pushed some of them beyond their endurance, motivated by what his aide described as a personal and consuming desire to hit Napoleon before dark. Napoleon committed his last reserve, the Imperial Guard, a 9-battalion formation that had never been broken in battle, whose reputation was so formidable that its advance had in previous engagements caused the enemy formations to break before they even had contact. The Guard advanced up the ridge in 2 columns in the early evening, taking appalling losses from gunfire. Near the crest, they encountered a British formation that had been hidden in the reverse slope and stood up to deliver volley fire at close range. The Guard stopped. They recoiled, and for the first time, they broke. Up and down the French line, the word passed with the speed of panic. La Garde recule. The Guard are retreating. Soldiers who had heard their positions through 10 hours of battle, well, they broke and they ran. The collapse was total. It was instant. The final squares of the Imperial Guard that had not broken held their formation as the rest of the army collapsed around them, falling back in the darkness, firing until there was no one left to give orders. It was the Guard's final act. The formation that had never broken maintained its discipline even in the catastrophe. General Cambronne, commanding one of the last squares, was offered surrender. His reply has been cleaned up a bit and translated in every subsequent account, but the version the French have always preferred, and, well, which may be accurate in the substance if not precisely in wording, is a single obscene monosyllable. Well, the squares were destroyed. Napoleon escaped the field in a carriage that was eventually abandoned as Prussian cavalry closed in, continuing on horseback. He reached Paris on June 21st. He had been back on the throne of France for 96 days. Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, was arrested after Waterloo and executed by firing squad in December of 1815, having been convicted of treason against the restored Bourbon monarchy. He refused a blindfold and gave the firing command himself. The remaining marshals mostly survived, managing the transition back to royalist service with varying degrees of embarrassment and relief. Murat, who had made a desperate attempt to hold his Neapolitan kingdom by switching sides and then switching back, and then launching an invasion of Italy with a tiny force in a venture of almost operatic doomed romanticism, was captured and shot in October of 1815. The Empire's principal figures, they didn't all die at Waterloo, but they did scatter, and they took their memories with them. In any case, all hope for Napoleon getting back what he wanted to get was gone. And so Napoleon abdicated for the second time on June 22nd, 1815, and travelled to Rochefort on the Atlantic coast with the vague idea that he might actually reach the United States, where he had a pretty cordial relationship with no one and no power base, but he was at least not actively imprisoned. The American option dissolved when British ships blockaded the port. After some days of deliberation, he surrendered himself to Captain Maitland of the HMS Bellerophon, apparently calculating that surrender to the British was preferable to capture by the Prussians, whose stated intention was to shoot him in the head. Yeah, it's probably preferable to go with the British. He is reported to have addressed Maitland with a formality that suggests he was already composing the scene for the historical record. Quote, "I come to throw myself on the protection of your prince and your laws." Maitland, a naval officer with no authority to offer anything, received him courteously, and he sailed for England. Now the British government, after brief consideration of whether to try him as a criminal and several other options, all of which had significant legal and political problems, decided to go for the Exile route. St. Helena, an island in the South Atlantic, roughly 2,000 kilometers from the coast of Africa, and 2,800 kilometers from South America. It's one of the most remote places on Earth. The choice was deliberate and transparent. St. Helena was so remote and so thoroughly surrounded by ocean that escape was effectively impossible. He arrived in October 1815, and he would never leave. Conditions of his captivity were considerably more restrictive than Elba had been. St. Helena was a remote, damp, frequently fogged-in place, and governed by Sir Hudson Lowe, a conscientious administrator whose caution about Napoleon's security expressed itself in a catalogue of petty restrictions. Limits on the range of his permitted rides, insistence on personally confirming his presence at regular intervals, disputes about the use of the title Emperor versus General Bonaparte, that Napoleon found both humiliating and strategically useful as material for the memoir he was writing. The climate was bad. The house at Longwood was damp and uncomfortable. Napoleon's health, which had been deteriorating since at least 1812, began on a more steady decline. He gained weight. He spent increasing amounts of time in bed, and he began to ramble on as he went on his walks. The 6 years Napoleon spent on St. Helena before his death in May 1821 were years of confinement, declining health, persistent conflict with his British jailer, Sir Hudson Lowe, whom Napoleon found petty, which was accurate, by the way. But he also said he was personally threatening, which, well, maybe not as accurate. But most consequently for the long run, of deliberate, sustained self-mythologization. The conversations recorded by Emmanuel de la Casse in the Memorial of St. Helen, published in 1823, and translated into multiple languages almost immediately, gave Napoleon's account of himself and his wars this, well, I suppose, heroic sort of tint. The European readership was not quite ready to receive it. The version he constructed was coherent, romantic, and strategically dishonest. Napoleon as the child of the Revolution, the bearer of the Enlightenment values to a feudal Europe that resisted them out of dynastic self-interest. The man who had been defeated, not by any failure of will or by judgment, but by the combined weight of every reactionary power of the continent, thrown simultaneously against a single man. The wars of aggression became wars of self-defense. The satellite kingdoms became experiments in enlightened governance. The Continental system became an attempt to establish a fair European trading order against a British monopoly. The Russian catastrophe became the consequence of Alexander's treachery, and the Russian winter, rather than of Napoleon's misjudgment. But legend worked, with a thoroughness that still shapes how Napoleon is discussed. Romanticism as a cultural movement was predisposed to the figure of the misunderstood great man broken by mediocre opposition. And Napoleon, of obscure origins, military genius, political visionary, brought low by the combined spite of an established order, he fit that template exactly. Stendhal, Heine, Hugo, Byron, Balzac, the greatest writers of the generation that came of the age of Waterloo, found in Napoleon a figure that satisfied the romantic imagination's requirements so precisely that the distinction between the historical Napoleon and the Napoleonic myth has become progressively harder to maintain. Stendhal, who had served in the Russian campaign and witnessed all the horror, nevertheless wrote of Napoleon with a reverence that his experience of the actual war had apparently done nothing to moderate. Balzac filled his novels with characters for whom Napoleon was the defining figure of possibility, the proof that talent and will could transcend birth and overcome every obstacle the old world placed in their path. The Emperor of the French became, in literary imagination, of the generation after his fall, a symbol larger than any emperor, an avatar of human aspiration against institutional limits, a man who had briefly proved that the possible was larger than the convention admitted. When Hugo wrote, "Waterloo, Waterloo, Waterloo's sombre plain," he was not writing history, but rather a requiem, a secular one at that. And he wrote it for a figure that was already partly becoming fiction. Napoleon's cause of death has been debated since the autopsy. The official British finding was stomach cancer. The later analysis of hair samples taken during his lifetime and preserved have detected elevated levels of arsenic, significantly elevated, raising the question of whether he was being deliberately poisoned. Now, the arsenic source has been variously attributed to the wallpaper in his damp residence, which contained arsenic-based pigment that mold converted to toxic vapor, but also to medicines of the period that routinely contained arsenic compounds, and to deliberate administration by persons with motives historians have speculated about at length. The question is probably irresolvable at this distance. He was 51 when he died, on an island where the damp climate and stress of confinement had been steadily eroding his health for 6 years. Now, whether the final cause was cancer, arsenic, or both, the island had already done most of the heavy lifting. So we can certainly say that the Napoleonic Wars reshaped Europe in ways that no subsequent diplomatic settlement, including the Congress of Vienna's considerable effort, was able to fully reverse. The death toll across the full period from 1792 to 1815 is estimated at somewhere between 3 and 5 million military deaths, with civilian losses through disease, famine, and direct violence adding 1 to 3 million. The uncertainty in these figures is not carelessness, don't get me wrong. The record-keeping of the period, particularly for deaths in the Russian and Spanish theaters, is just insufficient to support any more precision than that. But what can be said is that no comparable period in European history before the 20th century produced such comparable carnage. The Congress of Vienna's settlements was considerably more durable than is sometimes given credit for. Now, the Concert of Europe, a system of great power consultation and periodic congress that Metternich designed and that the settlement established, produced roughly 40 years of general European peace. There were some localized conflicts, but no war before the Crimean War of 1853 began its slow dissolution. By the standards of the 2 centuries that preceded it, 4 decades of great power peace was a remarkable achievement, and the credit belongs largely to the architects of Vienna, who understood that the settlement's durability depended on no power feeling it sufficiently aggrieved to overturn it. The legitimacy principle, the restoration of dynastic rulers, was the ideological cement, but the balance of power was the structural reality. France was restored quickly to great power status and brought into concert, rather than punished into permanent subordination, which was Talleyrand's most important contribution, and which proved to be essential to the settlement's stability. The contrast with the settlement after the First World War in 1919 is instructive, and was noted by the diplomats of 1919, the Congress of Vienna's relative moderation toward defeated power, and its incorporation of France as a full participant in the subsequent management of European affairs. It produced roughly 40 years of, not huge fighting, as we said, but, wars have to start again somehow, I'm afraid. The Treaty of Versailles' punitive treatment of Germany combined with Germany's exclusion from the League of Nations Inner Council, produced 20 years of resentment and another world war. The men at Vienna had learned something about how to end great conflicts that the men at Paris in 1919 had either not learned or just chose not to apply. The Napoleonic Code outlasted the Congress of Vienna, the restored Bourbon monarchy, the July monarchy, the Second Republic, the Second Empire, and every subsequent upheaval of French politics. It remains the foundation of French civil law and the model for the legal systems of a substantial portion of the world. Wherever Napoleon's armies marched and reformed legal structures of conquered territories, the Code Civil introduced the legal equality of persons before the law, the abolition of feudal privilege in civil matters, the standardization of property rights and inheritance, and the separation of civil status from religious affiliation. In many of these territories, the Code survived Napoleon's departure because it worked better than what it replaced, and because the populations who had lived under it were disinclined to return to that complex, inconsistent patchwork of custom and privilege that had preceded it. Legal reform was, in this respect, more durable than anything at the end of a gun. Then there was nationalism. That was another idea that the Napoleonic period released, and that could be a little dangerous, specifically because it was incompatible with the dynastic principle that the Congress of Vienna sought to restore. The Germans, who had experienced the French occupation, developed a German national consciousness partly in reaction to it. The Spanish, who had resisted French occupation and the imposition of a French king, developed a Spanish national consciousness partly in defending it. The Poles, whose Grand Duchy of Warsaw had gestured at a national restoration, would spend the next century in intermittent revolution against Russian, Prussian, and Austrian rule. And then there was the Italians. They'd watched Napoleon redraw the peninsula's map for his own convenience. They would eventually use the same redrawing to create a unified Italian state. But none of these nationalisms were created by the Napoleonic Wars. They were just catalyzed and clarified, radicalized by the experience of occupation, reorganization, and the revolutionary ideas that French armies spread involuntarily along with their baggage trains. The 1848 revolutions that swept Europe from Paris to Vienna, to Budapest to Berlin, were fueled by exactly this combination. The liberal political ideas that the revolution had articulated, the national identities the Napoleonic occupation had forced into sharper focus, and the generation of young Europeans who had grown up reading about the great events of the preceding decades, who found the restored conservative order of the Congress settlement both oppressive and, frankly, temporary. And they were right. It was temporary. They were premature about how soon it would end, fair enough, but the arc of the 19th century, from the Congress of Vienna to the shadows of 1848 and the unification of Italy in 1861, followed by Germany in 1871, that is the arc of the Napoleonic inheritance, working itself out over decades, in forms and at speeds that Napoleon himself could not have predicted, and would probably not have recognized as his own doing. Of course, Napoleon was long dead before his reputation recovered from Waterloo, but the recovery was rapid and eventually total. His body was returned to France in 1840, a decision of the July monarchy that unleashed an outpouring of public grief and popular celebration that astonished observers who had expected a generation's distance to have cooled such attachments. The cortege that carried his coffin through Paris drew an enormous crowd in December weather. Victor Hugo observed it from a balcony and wrote about it for the rest of his life. The remains were placed in the Hotel des Invalides, where they remain under the Great Dome and can be seen from most of Paris, in a sarcophagus of red porphyry that is by most accounts considered larger than necessary for a man who stood 5 foot 6 inches. Well, the scale of the tomb is a statement about what France was commemorating. The political shadow he cast over the 19th century was equally immense, though its most significant manifestation was not in France but in the career of his nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who used his uncle's name as a political platform through a career of imprisonment, exile, failed coups, and eventually electoral success that culminated in his own imperial coronation in 1852 as Napoleon III. The Second Empire lasted until 1870, and the catastrophic defeat by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War, a war that itself produced a unified German Empire under Prussian leadership, during the 19th century's most consequential geopolitical consequence of the Napoleonic period in a straight line from Leipzig to 1813 to Sedan in 1870. Napoleon III's career is, in some ways, the measure of his uncle's, the nephew that had the name and none of the genius. And the distance between them is the distance between greatness and imitation. Every major military power in Europe spent the century after Waterloo discovering Napoleon's strategies and studying them, and the military education the wars proved consequential in ways that extended beyond Europe. Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were educated in Napoleon's operational principles at West Point. The American Civil War's scale of maneuver and its use of railroad logistics to extend Napoleonic campaign distances to continental American proportions drew directly on the Napoleonic inheritance. Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, who commanded the Prussian forces in 1866 and 1870 with devastating effect, was a student of Napoleon's methods, who had identified the specific adaptations that the telegraph, railway, and breech-loading rifles required. The Prussian operational system that destroyed French armies in 1870 and Austrian ones in 1866, was in fundamental structure the Napoleonic system with a technological baseline update. Well, Napoleon remade Europe twice, once by conquering it, and once by losing it. The world that re-emerged was categorically not the one that existed before him. The ideas that the revolution had released could not be stuffed back into the bottles that the Congress of Vienna's diplomats were trying to reseal. The kings it restored to their thrones sat on those thrones above populations that had seen the old order dissolved and learned something they could not unlearn, that the social arrangements which presented themselves as natural and inevitable were in fact choices, and choices could be changed. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848 that swept Europe were not the legacy that Napoleon intended. They were rather the legacy that he created anyway, by carrying the revolution's promises into territories that had never heard them, and by demonstrating that through 2 decades of warfare and reorganization, that the world could be remade. The lesson his admirers took was that it could be remade by a great man. The lesson his subjects took was that it could be remade at all. The second lesson proved to be more durable. And that's where we end the Napoleonic Wars. Half about the wars, half about the man. Of course, you can't have one without the other. But I thank you for joining us as we finish up. And thank you for those supporting the channel financially and keeping us ad-free and crowd-funded, both on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the merch store, the donation links. That's about all. Carrier pigeon. I don't know. Maybe I should set that up, carrier pigeons, huh? I don't know, maybe. Anyway, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you in the next series. Oh, and if you've not watched the French Revolution one, well, perhaps that's your next stop. Anyway, good night, everyone. As usual, lots of love to you all over the world, and I will see you the next time you feel like learning something. Good night for now.